They called it blessed union, but Roman wedding nights included practices that would be illegal today. While you drift off tonight, you'll learn why Roman brides often spent their wedding night crying, and it wasn't tears of joy. The most disturbing part? These weren't random cruelties, but carefully orchestrated traditions everyone celebrated. Marriage in ancient Rome wasn't about finding your soulmate or falling madly in love. Forget everything you think you know about romantic weddings. Romans treated marriage like a business deal between powerful families. Love? That was optional. Actually, it was almost irrelevant. The wealthy elite used marriages to climb the social ladder or secure political alliances. Your father might promise you to someone you'd never met, simply because their family owned more land or had connections in the Senate. Makes sense, right? When survival and status mattered more than feelings, parents couldn't afford to let their children marry for romance. But here's where it gets interesting. Roman law required both the bride and groom to consent to the marriage. You couldn't force someone to marry against their will, at least not legally. The law called this consensus. Both parties had to agree. Of course, saying no to your father's choice came with serious consequences. Disobedient children might lose their inheritance, or get kicked out of the family entirely. Let's not forget how these weddings actually looked. They were massive displays of wealth and power. Rich families spent fortunes on elaborate ceremonies, not to celebrate love, but to show off their status to everyone in Rome. The bigger and more expensive your wedding, the more respect your family commanded. Think of it as the ancient version of Keeping Up with the Joneses, except the stakes were much higher. Wedding guests weren't just celebrating a happy couple, they were witnessing the joining of two family empires. When a senator's daughter married a wealthy merchant's son, it meant new trade partnerships, shared political influence, and combined fortunes. The bride and groom were almost secondary to the real business happening between their families. The weird part is how different Roman society was from ours when it came to divorce. During the early Republic, divorce was incredibly rare. Once you married someone, you stayed married. Period. Breaking up a marriage meant destroying carefully planned family alliances and potentially ruining both families' reputations. The social pressure to make marriages work was enormous. Roman wives had specific roles that went far beyond being loving partners. They managed the household, supervised slaves, and most importantly, produced legitimate heirs. A marriage that didn't produce children, especially sons, was considered a failure. Women who couldn't have babies faced shame, and sometimes divorce, no matter how much their husbands cared about them. Then there's the age factor that modern people find shocking. Roman girls often married as teenagers, sometimes as young as 12 or 13. Boys typically married in their 20s or 30s. These weren't love matches between equals. They were arrangements between families using their children as bargaining chips. Roman fathers held absolute power over their families, including the right to arrange marriages. This authority, called patria potestas, meant fathers could dissolve engagements, force marriages, or even break up existing marriages if it served the family's interests. Children were expected to obey without question. Marriage ceremonies reflected this power dynamic. The rituals emphasized the bride's transition from her father's control to her husband's authority. Every tradition, every symbol, every word spoken during the ceremony reinforced the idea that marriage was about family honor and social duty, not personal happiness. But Romans weren't completely cold-hearted about marriage. Many couples did develop genuine affection over time. Tombstone inscriptions from ancient Rome often mention loving relationships between spouses. The difference was that love was expected to grow after marriage, not before it. Upper-class Roman women actually enjoyed more legal rights than women in many other ancient civilizations. They could own property, run businesses, and initiate divorce proceedings under certain circumstances. Marriage gave them social status and protection, even if it limited their personal freedom. The pressure on Roman families to make strategic marriages created a complex web of relationships throughout the city. Everyone knew who was related to whom, which families were allies, and which ones were rivals. A single wedding could shift the balance of power in Roman politics. Roman marriage contracts were detailed legal documents that spelled out financial arrangements, property rights, and family obligations. These weren't romantic promises. They were binding agreements that protected both families' interests. Breaking these contracts could result in lawsuits and financial ruin. What's fascinating is how Romans justified this system. They believed that marriages based on family wisdom and social compatibility were more stable than those based on fleeting emotions. In their view, passionate love faded quickly, but carefully arranged marriages built lasting partnerships. The legal requirements for Roman marriage were surprisingly progressive in some ways. Both partners had to be free citizens, mentally competent, and above a certain age. Slaves couldn't legally marry, and marriages between close relatives were forbidden. These rules protected people from exploitation while maintaining social order. Of course, all these elaborate marriage politics were just the beginning. Before any Roman couple could actually get married, their families had to navigate the complex world of betrothals and dowries, formal agreements that could make or break entire family fortunes. Roman families treated betrothal like a business contract, not some romantic fairy tale. Forget Hollywood's version of ancient love stories. This was serious money talk between fathers who barely asked their children what they wanted for breakfast, let alone who they wanted to marry. The moment two Roman families shook hands on a betrothal, lawyers got involved. Yes, ancient Rome had lawyers, and they loved paperwork almost as much as modern ones do. Documents spelled out every detail. How much money, which property, what happens if someone dies. These weren't casual promises made over wine at dinner parties. But here's where it gets interesting. The dowry system was basically ancient Rome's version of insurance for women, though it came with a hefty price tag for her family. The bride's father had to cough up serious cash, land or valuable goods to seal the deal. Think of it as paying someone to take your daughter off your hands, except way more complicated and legally binding. Roman dowries weren't pocket change either. Wealthy families might hand over entire farms, slaves, jewelry collections or enough gold to buy a small army. Poor families scraped together whatever they could manage. Some fathers went into debt for years just to marry off one daughter. The pressure was intense because unmarried daughters were seen as family failures. Well, the dowry served a clever purpose beyond just greasing the wheels of negotiation. If the husband died, the wife got her dowry back. Smart Roman lawmakers figured out that widows needed something to live on, since women couldn't exactly run out and get jobs at the local construction site. The dowry became her safety net, her ticket to independence, or at least her chance to attract another husband. And the weird part is how early these betrothals could happen. Roman girls might find themselves engaged at age 10 or 12, sometimes to men they'd never even met. The actual wedding wouldn't happen for years, but the legal paperwork started immediately. Imagine being in middle school, and already having your entire adult life planned out by people who think you're still too young to choose your own clothes. Fathers treated these arrangements like military campaigns. Strategic thinking ruled everything. Which family had the best political connections? Who owned the most profitable businesses? Could this marriage help us climb the social ladder, or secure a better spot in the Roman pecking order? Love had about as much influence on these decisions as asking your pet dog to pick your retirement portfolio. Let's not forget the drama that erupted when betrothals went wrong. Breaking off an engagement wasn't like changing your mind about dinner plans. Families could end up in bitter feuds lasting generations. Money already spent on wedding preparations, gifts exchanged between families, social embarrassment in front of the entire neighborhood. The fallout could be spectacular. Roman law required both families to agree on the dowry amount before anything became official. Negotiations could drag on for months. The groom's family wanted maximum value, while the bride's family tried to minimize their financial hit. Ancient Roman matchmaking was basically high-stakes haggling with your daughter's future as the bargaining chip. Then there's the fascinating detail about dowry management during marriage. The husband controlled the dowry money and property while married, but he couldn't just blow it all on chariot races and expensive wine. Legal restrictions protected the wife's interests, at least on paper. If he wasted her dowry on gambling or bad business deals, she had some legal recourse, though actually getting justice was another story entirely. Young Roman men didn't escape this system either. Their families felt enormous pressure to negotiate favorable terms and secure brides from respectable houses. A man who couldn't attract a decent dowry was basically announcing to society that his family was either poor, scandalous, or completely lacking in social influence. The shame could follow him for life. The betrothal ceremony itself was surprisingly simple compared to all the legal complexity behind it. The couple exchanged rings, families made speeches about honor and duty, and everyone pretended the young people were thrilled about their arranged futures. The real action happened in private meetings between fathers, discussing property transfers and inheritance rights. But breaking a betrothal could trigger legal battles that made modern divorce proceedings look like friendly disagreements. Who kept the engagement gifts? What about money already spent on wedding preparations? Could the jilted family demand compensation for social embarrassment? Roman courts heard plenty of these messy disputes. Roman betrothal contracts sometimes included bizarre clauses covering every possible scenario. What if the bride or groom died before the wedding? What if one family's fortune suddenly collapsed? What if political circumstances changed and the marriage became socially awkward? Ancient lawyers thought of everything, creating documents longer than some modern novels. The months or years between betrothal and actual marriage created their own weird social dynamic. The engaged couple lived in limbo, not quite single but not yet married, while their families fine-tuned wedding arrangements and occasionally renegotiated terms. Speaking of wedding arrangements, Romans took planning these celebrations as seriously as military operations. Every detail mattered, starting with picking the perfect day that wouldn't anger the gods or jinx the marriage from the very beginning. Romans were absolutely obsessed with timing their weddings perfectly. They didn't just pick any random Tuesday and hope for the best. Every single day of the year fell into one of three categories: lucky, unlucky, or downright catastrophic for getting married. The consequences of choosing wrong? Well, let's just say divorce might be the least of your problems. The calendar looked like a minefield of forbidden dates. May was completely off limits for weddings. Romans believed marrying in May would bring death and disaster to the couple. The saying "bad girls marry in May" stuck around for centuries afterward. February was also sketchy because of purification rituals happening all month. And don't even think about scheduling a wedding during major religious festivals like Parentalia, when Romans honored their dead ancestors. Nothing kills the wedding mood quite like Ghost Month. But here's where it gets really specific. Romans divided their calendar into three types of days: Fas, Nephas, and Comitials. Fa's days were blessed by the gods for legal and religious activities, perfect for weddings. Nephas days were cursed for any official business. Comitials days were reserved for public assemblies and voting. Each month had maybe 8 to 12 actually good wedding days. Talk about limited options. The priests kept detailed records of every single day's spiritual status. Families couldn't just wing it and hope their chosen date worked out. They had to consult the Pontifex Maximus or other religious authorities who maintained the official calendar. These priests charged fees for their expertise, naturally. Getting married wasn't cheap when you needed divine approval for your date. Then there's the astrology angle, which Romans took deadly seriously. They believed the position of stars and planets at your wedding moment would shape your entire marriage. Venus needed to be in the right spot for love and fertility. Mars had to be positioned favorably to avoid conflict between families. Jupiter's placement determined whether the couple would prosper financially. Some families hired professional astrologers to calculate the most auspicious timing down to the exact hour. Weather played a huge role too, though not for the reasons you might expect. Romans didn't worry about rain ruining outdoor ceremonies. They cared about what the weather meant spiritually. Thunder during a wedding was considered either a great blessing from Jupiter or a terrible warning, depending on which direction it came from. Lightning struck fear into everyone's hearts. Sudden storms could force families to postpone everything and start the date selection process all over again. The harvest calendar influenced wedding timing just as much as religious concerns. Wealthy families wanted their weddings during seasons when the best foods were available. June became popular partly because it offered fresh fruits and vegetables for the feast. August and September worked well for families who wanted to show off their grain wealth. But winter weddings? Those were for families who either couldn't afford to wait or had seriously limited social connections. Let's not forget the political calendar either. If your family had any ambitions in Roman society, you absolutely could not schedule your wedding to conflict with important political events. Senate meetings, military campaigns, major trials, gladiator games sponsored by powerful politicians, all of these could overshadow your big day. Smart families coordinated with other influential households to avoid scheduling conflicts that might hurt attendance. Some superstitions around timing sound completely bizarre today. Romans believed certain lunar phases could curse a marriage with infertility. New moons were generally good, full moons were risky, and waning moons spelled doom for the relationship. They also worried about the day of the week. The gods had preferences, apparently. Venus liked her own day, naturally, but Mars could get jealous if you picked his day instead. And the weird part is how far in advance these decisions had to be made. Once a family settled on a date, changing it brought terrible luck and social embarrassment. Invitations went out months early because travel took time, and important guests needed notice. Breaking off a wedding because of date problems could destroy family reputations and political alliances. Wealthy families sometimes hedged their bets by consulting multiple priests and astrologers. If the experts disagreed about whether a particular date was safe, families would rather wait another year than risk divine anger. Better to have a delayed wedding than a cursed marriage that would bring shame on both households for generations. The pressure to pick the perfect day created intense family stress. Parents, grandparents, priests, astrologers, and political advisors all had opinions. Arguments erupted over whether religious concerns outweighed astrological warnings or political advantages. Some engagements fell apart entirely because families couldn't agree on timing, but all this careful planning and divine consultation was just the beginning. Once Romans finally settled on their blessed wedding date, they faced an entirely different challenge: getting the bride ready for her big day. The preparation rituals were just as precise and meaningful as choosing the date itself, and every single detail of her appearance carried deep symbolic weight that could make or break the marriage's future success. The Roman bride's transformation on her wedding day wasn't just about looking pretty. Every piece of clothing, every strand of hair, every accessory carried deep meaning that could make or break her future marriage. Romans believed the gods were watching, and one wrong detail might doom the couple forever. Her dress was surprisingly simple compared to what you might expect. The tunica recta was a long white garment that fell straight down to her feet without much decoration. White symbolized purity, but here's the twist: it wasn't just any white fabric. The dress had to be woven in a special way, often by the bride herself or her female relatives. The weaving process was considered sacred, and every thread was supposed to bind good fortune into the marriage. But the real magic happened with her hair. Roman brides couldn't just throw their hair up in any style. The hairdressing ritual was so important that it had its own name, the sex crines or six braids. Using a special spear-shaped tool called a hasta calabaris, her hair was carefully divided and braided into exactly 6 sections. Why 6? Romans believed this number connected the bride to ancient traditions and showed she was pure enough for marriage. The spear used for parting her hair had to come from a man who died happily married. Talk about pressure to find the right tool. Then came the most striking part of her outfit, the flammium. This bright orange veil covered her head and face, making her look almost like she was on fire. The color wasn't chosen randomly. Flame orange was sacred to the gods and was supposed to scare away evil spirits who might want to ruin the marriage. The veil was so important that taking the flammium became another way of saying getting married. Without it, she wasn't really a bride at all. Her feet told their own story too. Roman brides wore bright yellow sandals that announced her new status to everyone she passed. Yellow was the color of wealth and prosperity, hinting that this woman was joining a successful family. These weren't comfortable walking shoes either. They were designed to be seen and admired as she made her way through the wedding ceremony. What's fascinating is what Roman brides didn't wear. Heavy jewelry was actually discouraged because it suggested vanity and pride, 2 qualities that could anger the gods. Instead, she might wear just a simple wedding ring on her 4th finger, because Romans believed a vein ran directly from that finger to the heart. Any other jewelry had to be minimal and modest. The bride's makeup was equally restrained. A little bit of color on her cheeks and lips was acceptable, but anything too dramatic was considered inappropriate for such a sacred occasion. Roman women normally wore quite a bit of makeup, so this natural look made the bride stand out as pure and humble. Every morning before the wedding, female relatives would help with the dressing ritual. This wasn't just getting ready, it was a ceremony in itself. Each piece of clothing was put on in a specific order, while the women sang traditional songs and offered prayers for the bride's fertility and happiness. The process could take hours because nothing could be rushed or done carelessly. The most nerve-wracking part: everything had to be perfect the first time. If a braid came loose, if the veil slipped, if a sandal broke, these were seen as terrible omens that could predict divorce, infertility, or even death. Imagine trying to get dressed while knowing that one small mistake might convince everyone your marriage was doomed before it started. Roman mothers and aunts took this preparation incredibly seriously. They had special techniques passed down through generations for making sure everything stayed in place throughout the long wedding ceremony. Some used tiny pins and clips hidden in the hair and dress to prevent any wardrobe disasters. The strangest part of the bride's preparation involved her underwear, or rather the lack of it. Roman brides traditionally didn't wear undergarments on their wedding day because it was believed that any extra layers of clothing might block fertility. This was supposed to help ensure she would get pregnant quickly and produce the sons her new family desperately wanted. Weather didn't matter for the bride's outfit either. Whether it was blazing hot or freezing cold, she wore the same traditional clothing. The gods expected consistency, and changing the outfit for comfort was considered disrespectful to ancient customs. The preparation ritual also included burning incense around the bride's clothes to purify them and make them sacred. Every thread, every fold, every accessory was blessed before she put it on. Once the bride was fully dressed and prepared, she was considered transformed from an ordinary girl into a sacred vessel ready for marriage. But all this careful preparation was just the beginning. Next came the challenge of making her new home look worthy of the gods' attention. After all that careful preparation of the bride's appearance, someone had to make sure the wedding venue itself looked worthy of such an important family event. Roman weddings weren't thrown together at the last minute. Every flower, every piece of greenery, every torch had meaning and purpose. The bride's family home became the center of attention first. Workers would arrive early in the morning, arms full of fresh garlands. These weren't just random decorations grabbed from the nearest market stall. Laurel branches symbolized victory and triumph, perfect for a family celebrating a successful marriage alliance. Myrtle represented love and fertility, which everyone hoped would bless the new couple. The combination sent a clear message to anyone walking by. This house was celebrating something serious and sacred. Doorways received special treatment. Think of it as the Roman version of hanging wedding bunting, except with way more religious significance. Garlands wrapped around doorframes, sometimes so thick you could barely see the wood underneath. The front entrance got the most elaborate treatment because that's where the groom would eventually arrive to claim his bride. Neighbors could spot a wedding house from streets away just by looking for these telltale decorations. Inside the house, every room the wedding party would enter got its own floral makeover. Fresh flowers weren't cheap in ancient Rome, especially if you wanted the good stuff. Wealthy families might import exotic blooms from distant provinces just to show off their connections and money. Poorer families stuck to local wildflowers and greenery, but they arranged them just as carefully. The goal was creating an atmosphere that felt both festive and sacred. Then there's the matter of lighting. Romans took their torch game seriously. These weren't modern candles or electric lights. We're talking about actual flaming torches made from pine wood. Pine burned bright and smelled good, plus it had religious associations with certain gods. Torch holders would line the route from the bride's house to the groom's house, creating a flickering pathway of light. On cloudy days or evening weddings, these torches turned the whole procession into something magical. But here's where it gets interesting. The number of torches mattered. Too few and people might think your family was cheap or struggling financially. Too many and you risked looking like you were showing off inappropriately. Roman families had to hit that sweet spot of impressively wealthy but not obnoxiously flashy. Makes sense, right? Workers spent hours positioning torches at exactly the right intervals along the wedding route. They tested wind directions to make sure flames wouldn't blow out at crucial moments. Backup torches waited nearby in case of emergencies. The whole system required serious planning and coordination. Flowers played multiple roles beyond just looking pretty. Rose petals got scattered across floors where the wedding party would walk. Violets might decorate tables holding the wedding feast. Ivy vines wound around columns and doorways because ivy symbolized fidelity and lasting marriage bonds. Every bloom choice carried symbolic weight, and the weird part is, guests were expected to dress up their own homes too. If you lived along the wedding procession route, social pressure demanded you hang at least a few garlands on your front door. Refusing to participate could create lasting neighborhood grudges. Romans took community involvement in weddings very seriously. The bride's family coordinated color schemes throughout their house. White and yellow flowers dominated, matching the bride's outfit. Red accents appeared here and there, representing passion and the blood ties being formed between families. Purple showed up occasionally if the family could afford it, since purple dye cost more than most people's monthly income. Fresh greenery filled gaps between flower arrangements. Bay leaves, olive branches and various herbs created fragrant backgrounds for the more expensive blooms. These practical additions served double duty. They looked good, and many had protective properties against evil spirits. Romans believed strong-smelling plants could confuse malevolent forces trying to curse the wedding. Professional decorators existed for wealthy families who wanted everything perfect. These specialists knew which flowers bloomed when, which combinations looked best together, and how to make arrangements last all day without wilting. They guarded trade secrets about keeping cut flowers fresh and which vendors sold the highest quality materials. Weather could ruin weeks of careful planning. Rain turned flower petals into soggy mush, and made torch lighting nearly impossible. Strong winds scattered lightweight decorations across the neighborhood. Smart families prepared backup indoor routes and covered walkways, but nothing completely solved the weather problem. All this elaborate decoration served a deeper purpose than just looking nice. The visual splendor announced to the whole community that two important families were joining forces. Every neighbor, every passerby, every curious onlooker could see this wasn't just any ordinary day. Something significant was happening here. But once all those flowers were arranged and torches were lit, the real show could begin. The decorations had set the stage perfectly, and now it was time for the actual wedding guests to make their entrance. Picture the chaos of a Roman wedding morning. Not everyone could just show up at these ceremonies like modern weddings where distant cousins and college roommates somehow make the cut. Roman weddings were exclusive affairs, carefully curated guest lists that would make today's event planners weep with envy. Family members took priority, obviously. Close relatives from both sides gathered, creating what must have been interesting dynamics when you consider these families were essentially merging their political and financial futures. The bride's aunts, uncles and siblings mixed with the groom's clan, sizing each other up while pretending to celebrate. Makes sense, right? Then there's the fascinating detail about three boys leading the entire procession. These weren't random kids grabbed from the street. They had to be specifically chosen young males who symbolized the couple's future sons. The Romans were obsessed with male heirs, so having three boys march ahead was like a walking prayer for fertility. These boys carried special significance beyond just looking cute in togas. But here's where things get really interesting. The pronuba held the most crucial role among all the guests. This wasn't just any married woman they pulled from the crowd. She had to be married to her first husband still. No widows. No divorcees, no second marriages allowed. The Romans believed her marital success would somehow rub off on the new couple through proximity and participation. Talk about pressure. The priests arrived with their own entourage, bringing religious authority to what was already a heavily ritualized event. These weren't friendly neighborhood clergy offering warm blessings. Roman priests were serious business, trained in complex ceremonies and skilled at reading omens from animal sacrifices. Their presence transformed a family celebration into a sacred ritual with cosmic implications. What really made Roman wedding guests unique was the children. Young ones often sang during the ceremony, but not sweet lullabies or romantic ballads. Roman wedding songs could be surprisingly cheeky, filled with jokes about what the couple would be doing later. The adults encouraged this behavior because they believed humor and laughter brought good luck to marriages. Imagine explaining those lyrics to modern parents. The guest dynamics created fascinating social theater. Everyone watching knew this wedding represented way more than two people falling in love. Alliances were being formed, dowries exchanged, political connections solidified. Guests weren't just witnesses, they were participants in a complex social transaction that would ripple through Roman society for years. Let's not forget how carefully Romans controlled their guest lists. Inviting the wrong person could create family feuds lasting generations. Excluding someone important might end valuable friendships or business partnerships. The bride's family and groom's family had to negotiate not just the marriage terms, but who deserved invitations to witness their agreement. Well, the seating arrangements alone must have caused headaches. Roman society was obsessed with hierarchy and status. Where you sat when you spoke, how close you stood to the altar, everything mattered. Guests probably spent weeks beforehand figuring out proper protocol and who they needed to greet first. The musicians and entertainers traveled with the guest procession, creating a mobile party that moved through Roman streets. Neighbors who weren't invited could still participate by watching the spectacle pass by their homes. Fourth, the whole neighborhood became invested in the wedding's success, shouting encouragement and tossing flowers from their windows. And the weird part is how seriously Romans took the concept of witnesses. These weren't passive observers munching on wedding cake. Every guest served as a legal witness to the marriage contract. Their presence made the union official under Roman law. No witnesses meant no legitimate marriage, which could cause inheritance nightmares later. Roman wedding guests also brought specific types of gifts, not just whatever seemed nice at the market. Household items, practical tools, religious objects, everything had symbolic meaning related to fertility, prosperity, or protection from evil spirits. Gift-giving was another layer of ritual within the larger ceremony. The most successful Roman weddings created lasting bonds between guest families, not just the couple. Attendees often arranged marriages for their own children with other guests they met at the ceremony. Wedding networking was serious business in ancient Rome, but Roman hospitality meant feeding everyone who attended, which could bankrupt families hosting large weddings. The pressure to provide impressive food and entertainment while maintaining social standing pushed many Roman families into debt. Guests expected lavish treatment worthy of their status. The guest procession itself became part of the ceremony's magic. As this carefully chosen group moved from the bride's home toward the groom's house, they carried the marriage's legitimacy with them through Roman streets. Their collective presence transformed a private family matter into a public celebration that strengthened community bonds. What made this guest selection process even more crucial was knowing that some of these same people might witness the couple's divorce proceedings years later. Roman guests were investing in relationships that could last decades, through good times and potentially very awkward legal battles. Soon enough, these carefully chosen witnesses would watch something truly remarkable unfold as the actual ceremony began. After all the elaborate preparations and guest arrivals, the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The actual wedding ceremony was surprisingly simple compared to everything that came before it. No fancy speeches or lengthy rituals, just two people joining their lives together in front of their families and the gods. The bride and groom stepped forward to face each other near the household altar. This wasn't some grand stage production. The couple stood close enough that their families could see every expression, every nervous glance, every small smile. The pronuba, that specially chosen married woman we mentioned earlier, positioned herself nearby to guide the proceedings. Her job was to make sure everything went according to tradition. Then came the most iconic moment of any Roman wedding ceremony. The bride and groom joined their right hands together in what Romans called dextrarum iunctio. This handshake wasn't casual or quick. They clasped hands firmly, fingers interlocked, while everyone watched in respectful silence. The right hand was considered the hand of trust and honor. When Romans made business deals, or signed treaties, they used their right hands. Marriage deserved the same level of seriousness. But here's where things get interesting. The actual wedding vows were incredibly brief compared to modern ceremonies. The couple would speak a simple formula that roughly translates to "where you are, Gaius, I am Gaius." They used these generic names regardless of their real names. Gaius and Gaia were like saying John and Jane today. The bride essentially promised to follow her husband's destiny and become part of his family line. That's it. No lengthy promises about sickness and health or richer and poorer. No personal declarations of love or individual vows written from the heart. Romans kept their wedding promises short and to the point. The entire vow exchange probably took less than 2 minutes. The witnesses played a crucial role during this moment. Family members, friends, and the attending priests all had to hear the vows clearly. Roman law required witnesses to make a marriage legally valid. These weren't just guests enjoying a party. They were officially documenting that this union had taken place according to proper customs. Some of them might need to testify later, if there were ever legal questions about the marriage's legitimacy. While the couple spoke their vows, they faced toward the household altar where the family's protective gods resided. Romans believed their ancestors and household spirits needed to approve of new marriages. The altar usually held small statues or symbols representing these divine guardians. Turning away from the gods during vows would have been deeply disrespectful and potentially unlucky. The atmosphere during the vow exchange was remarkably solemn, considering all the festivities that surrounded it. Guests maintained respectful silence. No cheering or applause interrupted the sacred moment. Even the children, who had been singing playful songs earlier, knew to keep quiet during this part. Romans understood that calling on the gods required proper reverence and attention. Well, the simplicity of Roman vows might seem underwhelming by today's standards, but it served a practical purpose. These marriages weren't primarily about romantic love or personal compatibility. They were business arrangements between families, designed to strengthen political alliances, combine wealth, and produce legitimate heirs. Elaborate emotional declarations would have seemed out of place in such transactions. The pronuba sometimes whispered gentle reminders to nervous brides or grooms who forgot their lines. Young people, especially teenage brides, occasionally froze up during the ceremony. Having an experienced married woman nearby provided comfort and guidance during this intimidating moment. She might squeeze the bride's shoulder or nod encouragingly when it was time to speak. After the vows, the newly married couple remained holding hands for several more moments. This extended handshake allowed the witnesses to see clearly that both parties had participated willingly. Roman law insisted that both bride and groom consent to the marriage. Forced marriages, while they probably happened, weren't legally valid. The public handshake served as visible proof of mutual agreement. Then there's the fascinating detail about what happened immediately after the vows. The couple didn't kiss. Romans didn't include kissing in their wedding ceremonies. That romantic gesture came much later in wedding traditions. Instead, the newlyweds simply released their hands and turned to face their families. The prenuber might offer brief congratulations, but the real celebration was still to come. The entire vow portion of a Roman wedding ceremony lasted perhaps 10 to 15 minutes at most. Quick, efficient, and legally binding. No endless readings from poetry or lengthy blessings from multiple priests. Romans preferred to save the elaborate rituals and entertainment for other parts of the wedding day. But the vows were just the beginning of the sacred ceremonies. The couple still needed to make offerings to the gods to ensure divine protection for their new marriage. Jupiter himself required proper acknowledgement, and that meant it was time for one of the most important rituals of the entire wedding day. After the couple spoke their sacred vows and joined hands before their families, the ceremony took a decidedly more serious turn. The Romans believed that marriage wasn't just a contract between two people, it was a sacred bond that needed divine approval. And there was only one way to get that approval: through blood sacrifice. The priest stepped forward, leading a small pig toward the altar. This wasn't just any pig, mind you. The animal had been carefully selected, examined for flaws, and deemed worthy of Jupiter himself. The Romans took this stuff seriously. No sick animals, no runts, nothing that might offend the king of the gods. Makes sense, right? You wouldn't want to anger Jupiter on your wedding day. Well, here's where things got intense. The pig was sacrificed right there in front of everyone, including the bride in her pristine white tunic. Blood splattered on the altar, while guests watched in respectful silence. Modern couples complain about awkward wedding moments, but imagine explaining this to your squeamish relatives. The Romans saw it differently though. This was the most important part of the entire ceremony. But the sacrifice itself was only half the story. What happened next determined whether the marriage would be blessed or cursed. The priest carefully cut open the pig and examined its internal organs, particularly the liver. This practice, called haruspice, was like reading tea leaves but with much higher stakes. A healthy, properly colored liver meant the gods approved. Dark spots, unusual shapes, or diseased organs, that was bad news for the newlyweds. The weird part is how seriously everyone took these predictions. If the organs looked wrong, some families would actually postpone the wedding entirely. Imagine telling your 100 guests to go home because a pig's liver didn't look right. Yet this happened regularly in ancient Rome. The priests had extensive training in organ reading, studying for years to interpret every bump, discoloration, and abnormality. Then there was the financial aspect that nobody talks about. These sacrifices weren't cheap. A good pig cost real money, and the priest's services didn't come free either. The bride's family typically paid for everything, adding this expense to the already hefty dowry and wedding costs. Poor families sometimes had to settle for chickens or doves instead of pigs, though everyone knew this was second-rate divine insurance. Let's not forget the practical challenges of conducting animal sacrifice during a wedding. The altar had to be properly consecrated beforehand. Special knives were required. Regular kitchen utensils wouldn't do for the gods. Someone had to clean up the blood afterward, and the meat needed to be distributed among the guests. Roman weddings weren't just ceremonies, they were complex logistical operations, and here's something that might surprise you. The sacrifice wasn't always successful on the first try. Sometimes the animal would struggle, or the organs would look questionable, forcing the priest to try again with a second pig. Occasionally, families went through 3 or 4 animals before getting a satisfactory reading. The wedding guests had to stand around patiently while pig after pig was slaughtered and examined. The religious significance went deeper than just getting Jupiter's blessing. Romans believed that sharing the sacrificial meat created a spiritual bond between the two families. Everyone present ate from the same animal that had been offered to the gods, making them participants in the sacred ritual. This wasn't casual snacking. It was communion with the divine. But why Jupiter specifically? The Romans considered him the protector of marriage contracts and family relationships. He was the ultimate father figure, the one who could ensure the union would produce legitimate heirs and maintain family honor. Other gods might handle love or fertility, but Jupiter dealt with the serious business of legal marriage. The timing of the sacrifice mattered too. It had to happen after the vows but before the couple could be considered truly married. This created a nerve-wracking gap where the relationship hung in the balance. The bride and groom stood there, officially committed but not yet blessed, waiting to learn their fate from a pig's internal organs. Modern people might find this barbaric or superstitious, but Roman society was built on the idea that human affairs needed divine approval. Marriage affected property rights, inheritance, political alliances, and social status. The stakes were too high to leave anything to chance. The sacrifice also served as a public declaration that this wasn't some casual relationship. Families were investing real money and seeking divine approval, proving their commitment to making the marriage work. It was their way of saying, "We're serious about this union." Once the priest declared the organs favorable and Jupiter's blessing secured, the real celebration could begin. But the next ritual would be even more symbolic, sharing a simple cake that would bind the couple's destinies together in ways that went far beyond any legal contract. After all that solemn vow-taking and sacrificial drama, you might think the Romans were done with their sacred rituals. Not even close. The most important moment was still coming, and it involved cake. But this wasn't your typical wedding cake covered in fancy frosting. We're talking about far cake, a dense flat bread made from spelt wheat that looked about as appetizing as cardboard. The Romans didn't care if it tasted good. This cake had serious spiritual power. The bride and groom had to eat this cake together, right there in front of everyone. No feeding each other cute little bites like modern couples do. They each took a piece and chewed it down, probably trying not to grimace at the bland, chewy texture. The whole crowd watched every bite. Why was this such a big deal? Because sharing food created an unbreakable bond between two people. When you ate the same meal as someone, you literally became part of each other. The Romans believed the food mixed in your stomachs and connected your life forces forever. Gross? Maybe. But they took it seriously. The far cake ritual went way back to the earliest days of Rome when marriages were called conferatio, which literally means sharing of spelt. This wasn't just some quaint tradition. It was the most sacred form of marriage available, reserved for the upper classes and especially for priests. Regular folks could get married other ways, but if you wanted the gods to really pay attention to your union, you ate the cake. The preparation of this cake was no joke either. It had to be made from spelt that was grown in sacred fields, ground by special mills and baked according to ancient recipes passed down through generations. The baker couldn't just wing it. One wrong ingredient or cooking method could ruin the entire spiritual effect. Then there's the weird part about who could actually perform this ritual. Both the bride and groom had to have parents who were still alive and still married to each other. Divorced parents, deal breaker. Dead parents. Sorry, no cake ceremony for you. The Romans believed that only children from stable, intact families could properly channel the spiritual energy needed to make the ritual work. During the cake eating, everyone had to stay completely silent. No cheering, no clapping, no encouraging words. The couple chewed in absolute quiet while dozens of people stared at them. Talk about pressure. If either person choked or spit out the cake, it was considered a terrible omen for the marriage. The leftover pieces of cake weren't thrown away like normal food scraps. They were carefully collected, and either burned as offerings to the gods or buried in the family garden. Some families saved crumbs in special containers and brought them out during family prayers throughout the year. Every bit of that cake was considered sacred. Let's not forget that this cake sharing created legal consequences too. A marriage sealed with conferatio was incredibly difficult to undo. While other types of Roman marriages could be dissolved fairly easily, a couple who shared the far cake was bound together until death. Divorce required a complicated reverse ceremony called differatio where they had to, somehow uneat the cake spiritually. Most couples never bothered trying. The moment the last bite disappeared, the crowd finally erupted in congratulations. People shouted felicita, which meant good luck. Over and over, the newlyweds were officially and completely married in the eyes of gods and humans alike. Their families were now joined forever, their property legally combined, and their children would carry the highest form of legitimacy Roman society could offer. But here's what made the whole thing even more intense. Many of these brides were teenagers who had never tasted spelt cake before this moment. They had no idea what to expect. Some probably worried they might throw up from nervousness or disgust. Roman writers occasionally mentioned brides who got so anxious during the cake ritual that they fainted before finishing their portion. The grooms didn't have it much easier. They knew that every chew was being analyzed by their new in-laws for signs of enthusiasm or reluctance. Eat too fast and you looked greedy. Eat too slow and people wondered if you were having second thoughts. The pressure was enormous. What's really fascinating is how this simple act of sharing food created such a powerful psychological bond. Even couples who barely knew each other before their wedding day often reported feeling genuinely connected after eating the far cake together. Maybe it was just the intensity of the moment. Or maybe the Romans understood something deep about human psychology that we've forgotten. Of course, all this sacred cake eating was just the warm-up act. Because once the couple finished chewing and the congratulations died down, things were about to get seriously weird. The Romans had some very specific ideas about what should happen next, and it involved nuts flying through the air at high speed. After sharing that sacred far cake and sealing their marriage bond, Roman wedding guests knew the real fun was about to begin. What came next wasn't solemn or serious at all. The crowd would suddenly start hurling nuts and sweets at the newlyweds like they were under attack from a candy store explosion. This wasn't some random food fight that got out of hand. The nut-throwing tradition held deep meaning for Romans, even though it looked absolutely chaotic to outsiders. Walnuts were the ammunition of choice, and guests came prepared with pockets full of them. The moment seemed right. Someone would shout, and suddenly the air filled with flying nuts, dried fruits, and honeyed sweets. Why walnuts specifically? Romans believed these wrinkled little treasures symbolized fertility and the promise of children. The harder the shell, the stronger the future family would be. Guests weren't just pelting the couple for laughs. They were literally throwing wishes for babies at them. Makes sense when you think about it that way, right? But here's where things got wonderfully messy. The children at the wedding would go absolutely wild when the nut throwing started. They'd scramble around on the ground, diving between adult legs to collect as many nuts as possible. Picture a bunch of kids in their best togas, suddenly transformed into nut-hunting maniacs, stuffing their cheeks like chipmunks. The adults found this hilarious, and the louder the chaos got, the better the omen for the marriage. The bride and groom had to stand there and take it, smiling graciously while getting bonked by flying walnuts. Ducking or covering your head was considered bad form. You were supposed to let those fertility symbols rain down on you with dignity, though some brides probably wished they could shield themselves when a particularly enthusiastic guest had excellent aim. Then there's the volume level to consider. Roman weddings weren't quiet, refined affairs. The nut-throwing came with shouting, cheering, and general mayhem that could probably be heard 3 streets away. Neighbors knew exactly when this part of the ceremony happened, because the noise level jumped from festive gathering to small riot in progress. Different families had their own variations on the tradition. Some threw figs and dates along with the nuts. Others included small coins, which made the children even more excited to participate in the ground scramble. Wealthy families might toss exotic treats imported from distant provinces, showing off their status even during the nut bombardment. The timing mattered too. Guests couldn't just start flinging nuts whenever they felt like it. There was a proper moment, usually right after the cake sharing, but before the bride's dramatic farewell scene. Jump the gun on nut throwing, and you'd mess up the whole ceremony flow. Wait too long, and the moment would pass. What's fascinating is how this wild tradition connects to our modern wedding customs. That handful of rice or birdseed thrown at today's couples, direct descendant of Roman nut throwing. Though modern wedding venues probably appreciate rice more than walnuts, easier to sweep up afterward, and less likely to leave guests with bruises. Some Roman writers described nut throwing as absolutely essential for a successful marriage. Skip this part, and the couple might struggle to have children. The gods expected to see those nuts flying, and disappointed deities made for disappointed families. Superstition ran deep in Roman culture, and nobody wanted to risk angering the fertility spirits over something as simple as nut throwing. The mess afterward was legendary. Crushed walnut shells, sticky honey residue, and scattered fruit created a disaster zone that servants spent hours cleaning up. But Romans considered this debris lucky. Some families would save pieces of the wedding nuts and keep them as charms for the newlyweds' future home. Foreign visitors to Rome often wrote about how bizarre this tradition seemed. Greeks had their own wedding customs, but aggressive nut throwing wasn't one of them. Egyptian diplomats and Germanic traders probably wondered if Romans had lost their minds during these celebrations. Yet Romans took it completely seriously, viewing the nut barrage as crucial to marital success. The bride's elaborate orange veil provided some protection from direct hits, though nuts had a way of getting tangled in those 6 ceremonial braids. Grooms in their formal togas couldn't dodge effectively without looking undignified. Both had to endure the friendly assault with good humor, no matter how many walnuts found their mark. Even the poorest Roman families managed to scrape together nuts for throwing. Wealthy relatives might contribute expensive treats, but plain walnuts worked just fine for ensuring fertility. The gods cared more about the gesture than the cost of the ammunition. After surviving the nut bombardment, the couple knew their ordeal was far from over. The bride still faced the most emotionally charged moment of the entire wedding day. Her dramatic farewell to family was coming next, complete with tears, theatrical resistance, and heart-wrenching goodbyes that would make everyone believe she was truly reluctant to leave her childhood home behind. After the cake was eaten and the nuts stopped flying, things took a theatrical turn. The Roman bride suddenly had to transform from a happy celebrant into a reluctant participant. This wasn't optional. It was showtime. The bride began her dramatic farewell by clinging to her mother's robes. Tears needed to flow down her cheeks. Whether real or manufactured for the occasion, her face had to show the perfect blend of sorrow and modesty. Roman society expected nothing less than a full performance of reluctance and fear about leaving her childhood home. But here's the fascinating part. Everyone knew it was mostly an act. The bride had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She understood her role in Roman society. Marriage was her destiny, her path to respectability and purpose. Yet she still had to pretend she was being dragged away against her will. Family members played their parts too. Her mother wailed and held her tight. Sisters grabbed at her arms. Even her father might shed a tear or two, though his were likely more genuine. After all, he was losing a daughter and gaining political connections. The emotional complexity was real, even if the dramatics were scripted. The bride's reluctance served a deeper purpose than mere theater. Ancient Romans believed that spirits and gods were always watching, always judging. If a young woman appeared too eager to leave her family home, it might anger the household gods. Worse, it could suggest she was immodest or overly sexual. Neither impression would bode well for her marriage. Roman writers described brides who buried their faces in their hands, who trembled visibly, who had to be coaxed and comforted by relatives. Some sources mention brides who fainted from the emotional intensity. Whether these swoons were genuine or performed is anyone's guess. Probably a mix of both, depending on the individual woman and her circumstances. The tears weren't just for show either. Many Roman brides were genuinely sad to leave their families. Some were marrying men they barely knew. Others were moving to distant cities where they'd have no friends or familiar faces. The ritual allowed them to express real fears and anxieties while fulfilling social expectations. Let's not forget the age factor here. Many Roman brides were teenagers, sometimes as young as 14 or 15. The prospect of leaving everything familiar behind would terrify most modern teenagers. Roman girls faced the same fears but with much less choice in the matter. The bride's dramatic performance also protected her reputation in the community. Neighbors and guests who witnessed her reluctance could testify to her modesty and proper upbringing. This mattered enormously in Roman society, where a woman's reputation affected her entire family's standing. Well, the show had to look convincing. The bride might sob that she wasn't ready, that she needed more time with her family. She could protest that she was too young, too frightened, too unprepared for marriage. Her female relatives would comfort her with gentle words about duty and destiny, about the honor of becoming a wife. Roman men understood this performance too. Grooms weren't offended by their bride's tears or protests. They expected it. A bride who smiled too widely or seemed overly enthusiastic might actually concern her new husband. Was she properly raised? Did she understand the seriousness of marriage? And the reluctance was reassuring. And the weird part is, this fake resistance made the eventual kidnapping feel more legitimate to everyone watching. When the bride finally gave in to her fate, it seemed like a natural progression rather than a sudden change of heart. The drama built suspense and made the resolution more satisfying for the audience. The bride's farewell speech often included promises to honor her parents and remember her upbringing. She might beg forgiveness for any childhood mistakes or shortcomings. These words served as a final demonstration of her good character and proper education. Every phrase was calculated to impress the watching crowd. Some brides got creative with their performances. Historical accounts mention women who composed elaborate poems of farewell or who sang traditional songs of leaving home. The more artistic and emotional the display, the more the community praised her sensitivity and refinement. The timing of this farewell was crucial too. It couldn't happen too early in the ceremony. or guests might think she was genuinely unwilling to marry. It couldn't happen too late, or the performance would feel rushed and unconvincing. The bride had to gauge the crowd and choose her moment perfectly. But this emotional theater was just the warm-up act. The real spectacle was about to begin, because someone was about to grab the weeping bride right out of her mother's arms. The ritual kidnapping that followed would make her farewell performance look subtle by comparison. The tears were flowing, the dramatic farewell was complete, and now came one of the most bizarre wedding traditions in Roman history. Time for the donum deductio, the ritual kidnapping that wasn't really a kidnapping at all. Here's where things got theatrical. The groom and his friends had to literally grab the bride from her mother's arms, not gently either. They pulled, tugged, and struggled to tear her away from her family home. The bride would fight back, kicking and screaming like she was being abducted by strangers. Her mother wailed, her sisters sobbed. Everyone acted like this sweet girl was being dragged off to certain doom. But here's the weird part. It was all completely fake. Every single person knew this was going to happen. The whole thing was rehearsed, planned, and expected. The bride wasn't actually scared. The mother wasn't genuinely heartbroken. The groom wasn't some barbaric caveman stealing a woman. Yet they all played their parts like Oscar-worthy actors. The Romans had a fascinating reason for this elaborate charade. They believed that spirits and gods were watching every wedding closely. These supernatural beings were apparently pretty judgmental about women who seemed too eager to leave their family homes. A bride who walked willingly to her new husband's house. That was suspicious. She must be up to something immoral. Ancient Roman logic worked like this. A pure, virtuous woman should be reluctant to leave her childhood home and enter married life. She should need to be convinced, coaxed, even forced. Only loose women or those with questionable morals would skip happily toward marriage. The fake kidnapping proved to any watching spirits that this bride was modest, innocent, and properly reluctant. The performance had to look convincing too. Half-hearted struggling wouldn't fool the gods. The bride needed to dig in her heels, reach desperately for her mother, and cry real tears. Her family had to grab onto her dress, her arms, her hair, anything to keep her home just a little longer. The louder everyone wailed, the more the spirits would believe this was a respectable young woman being properly dragged into married life. Then there's the community aspect that made everything even more chaotic. Neighbors poured out of their houses to watch the spectacle unfold. Friends from both families joined the mock battle, some helping the groom's side kidnap the bride, others assisting her family's desperate attempts to keep her home. Children ran between everyone's legs, probably not entirely sure what was happening, but excited by all the shouting and drama. The whole street became a stage. People who barely knew the families stopped to watch and cheer. Vendors selling food or crafts abandoned their stalls to see the show. Even slaves paused in their daily tasks to witness the elaborate performance. Roman neighborhoods were tight-knit, and a wedding kidnapping was better entertainment than anything else happening that day. Music added another layer to the madness. Flute players followed the action, providing a soundtrack to the chaos. Drummers pounded rhythms that matched the struggle. Singers belted out traditional songs about brides leaving home, their voices mixing with the fake screams and sobs of the wedding party. The noise could probably be heard 3 blocks away. What makes this tradition even stranger is how seriously everyone took something so obviously fake. Roman writers described these kidnapping scenes with the same gravity they used for actual religious ceremonies or important legal proceedings. They listed the proper way to grab a bride, the correct responses from family members, and the appropriate duration for the struggle. Breaking character or laughing during the performance was considered bad luck. The kidnapping also served a practical social purpose beyond fooling supernatural beings. It publicly demonstrated that this marriage was happening whether the bride wanted it or not. In a society where family honor and social status mattered enormously, showing that the bride's family was losing their daughter against their will protected everyone's reputation. No one could later gossip that the bride's parents were eager to get rid of her or that she was desperate to escape her home. Smart families sometimes used the chaos as cover for more practical concerns. While everyone focused on the dramatic kidnapping scene, servants quickly moved the bride's belongings and dowry items to carts waiting nearby. The fake struggle bought them time to organize the real logistics of moving a young woman's entire life from one household to another. Eventually, the groom's team had to win the battle. The bride would go limp in defeat, her family would step back in apparent despair, and the victorious groom would scoop up his prize. But the show wasn't over yet. The real spectacle was just getting started as this dramatic parade prepared to snake through the streets toward the groom's house, where even more elaborate traditions waited. After that dramatic kidnapping, the real spectacle began. The streets of Rome transformed into a living theater as the wedding procession made its way from the bride's family home to her new life. This wasn't just a walk across town, it was a carefully orchestrated parade that could stretch for hours, depending on how wealthy the families were and how much they wanted to show off. Picture the scene: torchbearers led the way, their flames dancing against stone walls and creating shadows that danced along with the crowd. The bride, still clutching her orange veil and trying to look appropriately modest, walked surrounded by a sea of guests who treated this journey like the entertainment event of the season. Romans loved a good show, and wedding processions delivered exactly that. The route itself became part of the spectacle. Flower petals carpeted the cobblestones, creating a fragrant pathway that guests trampled with gleeful abandon. Garlands hung from doorways and windows as neighbors peered out to catch a glimpse of the procession. Even people who didn't know the families often joined in, because free entertainment was hard to pass up in ancient Rome. Music filled the air, but not the romantic melodies you might expect. Roman wedding songs could be surprisingly raunchy, with lyrics that would make modern parents cover their children's ears. The crowd sang about fertility, future children, and the groom's masculine prowess with a frankness that shocked even some Romans. These weren't quiet hymns, they were boisterous anthems that echoed off buildings and announced to the entire neighborhood that a wedding was happening. Then there were the professional musicians hired for the occasion. Flute players, drummers and singers competed with the crowd's amateur performances, creating a cacophony that served a practical purpose. All that noise wasn't just for fun, it was believed to scare away evil spirits who might want to curse the new marriage. The louder and more chaotic the procession, the better protected the couple supposedly became. Guests carried gifts during the walk, but these weren't neatly wrapped packages. People brought practical items like kitchen tools, furniture, and household goods that the bride would need in her new home. Some wealthy families turned this into a competition, with relatives trying to outdo each other with increasingly expensive presents. The procession became a mobile display of the family's combined wealth and social connections. Children played a special role in these parades, darting between adults to collect the nuts and sweets that guests threw constantly. Boys scrambled for walnuts while girls gathered flower petals, creating mini chaos within the larger celebration. Their laughter and shouts added another layer to the already noisy festivities, and parents encouraged this behavior because children were thought to bring good luck to the newlyweds. The bride's behavior during this journey required careful balance. She needed to appear reluctant to leave her family home while also showing appropriate joy about her marriage. Too much enthusiasm made her seem immodest, but too much sadness suggested she didn't want to marry her chosen husband. Many brides probably felt genuinely nervous about this public performance, knowing that neighbors would gossip about how well they handled themselves. Weather could make or break these processions. Rain was considered terrible luck and would send everyone scrambling for shelter, but a sunny day meant the parade could stretch on for hours. Some families planned elaborate routes that wound through the most prestigious parts of town, essentially giving themselves a free advertisement of their social status. The longer the route, the more people saw the procession, and the more the family's reputations benefited. Professional entertainers sometimes joined the parade, performing tricks and jokes to keep the crowd engaged during longer processions. Acrobats, dancers and comedians transformed the wedding march into a street festival that attracted even more spectators. Wealthy families competed to hire the best performers, turning their children's weddings into public relations campaigns. The procession also served practical purposes beyond entertainment. It officially announced the marriage to the community, making the union legally and socially recognized. In a world without official marriage certificates, this public display served as proof that the wedding had actually happened. Witnesses from the procession could later testify about the marriage if legal questions arose. As the parade wound through Roman streets, vendors often set up along popular routes, selling food and drinks to spectators. Some enterprising merchants followed wedding processions, knowing that excited crowds made excellent customers. The entire event became an economic boost for local businesses, especially when prominent families were involved. The energy of these processions was infectious. Even serious Romans found themselves caught up in the celebration, clapping along with the music and shouting blessings at the couple. The communal nature of the event reinforced social bonds and reminded everyone of their shared values about family and marriage. But all this noise and celebration was building towards something crucial. The real test of the wedding's success waited at the end of this journey, when the bride would face her first challenge as a married woman, crossing the threshold of her new home without stumbling. The parade reaches its destination, And now comes one of the most nerve-wracking moments of the entire Roman wedding, the threshold. That seemingly innocent strip of wood or stone at the entrance to the groom's house held enough superstitious weight to make or break a marriage before it even began. Romans believed evil spirits lurked everywhere, but they were especially fond of hanging around doorways. These malicious entities loved nothing more than tripping up a new bride as she entered her future home. One stumble, one awkward step, and the marriage was doomed from the start. The solution: the groom had to physically lift his bride and carry her across the threshold. This wasn't some romantic gesture born from love and affection. This was pure practicality mixed with terror of supernatural revenge. The bride's feet couldn't touch the threshold, because that would give evil spirits the perfect opportunity to grab her ankles and send her tumbling. Romans took this so seriously that wealthy families sometimes hired strong men to assist the groom if he looked too weak to manage the lift properly. The bride played her part in this theatrical moment too. She couldn't appear eager to cross into her new life. Instead, she had to look reluctant, maybe even frightened. This wasn't entirely acting for many young brides who were genuinely terrified about what lay ahead. The spirits needed to believe she was being taken against her will, not rushing headlong into marriage like some shameless woman. But here's where things get interesting. The threshold ritual served multiple purposes beyond just fooling evil spirits. It demonstrated the groom's strength and capability as a protector. A man who couldn't even lift his bride over a doorstep wasn't going to inspire much confidence in his ability to provide for a family. Roman society valued physical prowess, and this moment put the groom's abilities on full display for all the wedding guests to witness. The doorway itself was decorated for the occasion, draped with garlands and flowers that had been carefully selected for their protective properties. Laurel leaves warded off lightning strikes from Jupiter, while myrtle promised fertility and love. The scent of fresh greenery filled the air as the crowd pressed close to watch the crucial moment. Guests held their breath as the groom approached the threshold with his bride in his arms. Some muttered prayers under their breath. Others made subtle gestures to ward off bad luck, like touching iron or making the sign against the evil eye. The pressure was intense because everyone knew that a successful threshold crossing meant the marriage had divine approval. The actual lifting technique mattered too. The groom had to scoop up his bride smoothly, without fumbling or dropping her. She needed to keep her arms properly positioned and her veil arranged modestly. Any wardrobe malfunction or clumsy movement could be interpreted as a bad omen. Roman brides probably practiced this moment beforehand, making sure their long white tunics wouldn't trip them up or expose too much ankle. Once safely across, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Musicians struck up celebratory tunes while guests threw more nuts and flower petals. The bride had officially entered her new home without offending any supernatural forces, and the marriage could proceed with divine blessing intact. Then there's the practical side that Romans never ignored. Crossing the threshold marked the legal moment, when the bride left her father's household and joined her husband's family. She was no longer under her father's authority, but her husband's. This transfer of power happened the instant her feet touched the floor on the other side of the doorway. Roman law was very specific about these details. The threshold itself often became a family heirloom of sorts. Some wealthy Romans installed elaborate marble thresholds with protective symbols carved into the stone. These weren't just decorative elements but functional magical barriers designed to keep harmful spirits at bay permanently. Future generations would cross the same threshold when they brought their own brides home. Different regions of the Roman Empire added their own local variations to the threshold ritual. In some areas, the bride threw coins behind her as she was carried across, symbolically paying off any lingering evil spirits. Other regions required the groom to recite specific prayers or make offerings to the household gods before attempting the crossing. The whole spectacle created a perfect dramatic pause in the wedding festivities. The journey from the bride's family home had been loud and chaotic, full of singing and celebration, but at the threshold, everything went quiet for a moment, as everyone focused on this make-or-break instant. The silence made the subsequent explosion of joy even more powerful when the crossing succeeded. What happened next inside the groom's house would determine how well this threshold crossing had actually worked, as the bride prepared to light her first fire as mistress of her new home. Once the bride crossed that threshold, her real work began. The moment her feet touched the floor of her new home, she wasn't just a visitor anymore. She was the new mistress of the house, and everyone expected her to prove it. The first thing she had to do: light the hearth fire. This wasn't just about keeping the house warm or getting ready to cook dinner. This was pure ritual, loaded with meaning that went back centuries. The bride would take a special torch, usually the same one that had lit her way during the wedding procession, and use it to kindle the household fire. But here's where it gets interesting. The torch wasn't just any old stick with flames on it. Romans believed this torch connected the bride to her ancestors and the spirits that protected the home. When she lit that fire, she was basically announcing to every ghost, god and guardian spirit in the place, "Hey, I live here now. Please don't curse me." The whole crowd of wedding guests would gather around to watch this moment. No pressure at all, right? The bride had to get the fire going while wearing that long white dress, with everyone staring at her, probably after hours of celebrating and ceremony. One wrong move and she could set herself on fire. Talk about performance anxiety. Then came the really fun part. After getting the fire blazing nicely, the bride would dramatically blow out the torch, not a gentle puff, mind you. She had to extinguish it completely, showing that the old fire, the one from her parents' home, was officially done. Her new life started with this new flame. What happened next sounds like something from a modern sporting event. The bride would toss that smoking torch into the crowd of guests, and they'd scramble for it like kids fighting over candy. Whoever caught the torch was supposed to have extra good luck, especially in matters of love and marriage. Imagine grown Roman citizens diving over each other for a burnt stick, the things people do for luck. The symbolism here ran deeper than just fire and torches though. Romans saw the hearth as the absolute center of family life. Every home had household gods called lull and penates who supposedly lived around the fireplace. These weren't scary gods, more like helpful roommates who kept an eye on things. By lighting the fire, the bride was introducing herself to these invisible housemates and asking for their protection. Let's not forget that fire meant survival in ancient Rome. No fire meant no cooked food, no warmth, no light after dark. When the bride lit that hearth, she was taking responsibility for keeping her family alive and comfortable. Heavy stuff for someone who might have been barely 16 years old. The weird part is how this simple act transformed her legal status too. Before lighting the fire, she was still technically part of her father's family, even though she'd just gone through an entire wedding ceremony. But once those flames caught and she'd completed this ritual, she officially belonged to her husband's household. The fire made it legal. Some brides got creative with the torch tossing part. Roman writers mention cases where brides aimed their torches at specific people in the crowd, maybe a younger sister who was hoping to marry next, or a friend who'd been unlucky in love. Others made it a game, seeing how far they could throw the torch, or trying to make it land in a particular spot. Roman families took this fire lighting so seriously that they'd sometimes keep a bit of the flame burning for days or even weeks after the wedding. They believed that as long as that original wedding fire kept going, the marriage would stay strong. Some paranoid families assigned servants to watch the fire around the clock, terrified that letting it die out would doom the newlyweds. But what really made this ritual special was how it connected the bride to generations of Roman women who'd done exactly the same thing. Her mother had lit a hearth fire on her wedding day. So had her grandmother, and her great-grandmother, stretching back hundreds of years. Every Roman bride became part of this unbroken chain of women who'd stood in front of their new families and proven they could handle the responsibility of keeping a home running. The fire ritual also served as a practical test. Could this young woman handle pressure? Could she manage an important task while everyone watched? Could she adapt quickly to her new role? Romans valued competence above almost everything else, and this simple ceremony let everyone see if the bride had what it took. Of course, lighting the hearth was just the beginning. Once that torch hit the ground and the crowd finished fighting over it, the bride had to prove her domestic skills in even more dramatic ways. After lighting the sacred fire, the new bride couldn't just sit around looking pretty. Roman society had very specific expectations for what came next, and they weren't subtle about it. The assembled guests watched intently as she performed tasks that would define her role for the rest of her married life. The most important activity was spinning wool. Not just any wool, mind you, but wool that had been specially prepared for this exact moment. The bride would take the distaff in her left hand and the spindle in her right, demonstrating her skill in front of everyone who mattered. This wasn't some casual hobby demonstration either. Every twist of the thread carried deep meaning about her future duties as a wife and mother. Spinning wool symbolized the bride's transformation from daughter to household manager. The Romans believed that a woman who could spin well would manage her home efficiently, care for her family properly, and produce healthy children. Makes sense, right? If you could handle the delicate process of turning raw wool into usable thread, you probably had the patience and skill needed for raising kids and running a household. But here's where it gets interesting. The guests didn't just politely applaud her spinning skills, they actively cheered her on, shouting encouragement and making jokes about how many future Roman citizens she'd clothe with her handiwork. The atmosphere was part serious ritual, part rowdy celebration. Ancient Romans knew how to mix business with pleasure. Then there's the touching of water and fire. After the spinning demonstration, the bride had to physically interact with these two essential elements of Roman domestic life. She would dip her fingers in a bowl of clean water, symbolizing purification and the cleansing duties she'd perform in her new home. Fire came next, as she touched the flames or held burning materials, representing her responsibility for cooking, heating, and maintaining the household's warmth. The symbolism here goes deeper than practical household management. Water and fire represented the fundamental forces of creation and destruction that every Roman wife needed to balance. Too much of either could ruin a home, but the right combination created life, comfort, and prosperity. The bride's gentle interaction with both elements showed the guests that she understood this delicate balance. Ancient Roman writers took these rituals seriously, but they weren't immune to the humor in the situation either. Picture this newly married teenager, nervous as anything, trying to spin perfect thread while dozens of wine-soaked relatives shout advice at her. Some brides probably fumbled the wool or accidentally burned their fingers on the flames. The crowd's reaction to these little mishaps could make or break the evening's mood. Speaking of wool and future children, the Romans weren't exactly subtle about their expectations. The very act of spinning thread was considered a fertility charm. The circular motion of the spindle, the creation of something new from raw materials, the continuous thread that could go on forever, all of this supposedly encouraged the gods to bless the marriage with many offspring. Every loop and twist carried hopes for sons who would carry on the family name and daughters who would make advantageous marriages. The guests paid particular attention to how smoothly the thread emerged from the bride's hands. Perfectly even thread meant a harmonious marriage ahead. Lumpy or broken thread, well, that might indicate some rough patches in the future. Ancient Romans read omens into everything, and wedding night thread quality was no exception. What's fascinating is how these tasks served multiple purposes simultaneously. They demonstrated practical skills, performed religious rituals, entertained the guests, and provided opportunities for family bonding. The bride's mother might offer gentle corrections to her spinning technique, while the groom's female relatives sized up their new family members' abilities. Let's not forget that many of these brides were quite young, sometimes barely into their teens. The pressure of performing these tasks perfectly in front of critical relatives must have been intense. Ancient sources mention brides whose hands shook so badly from nerves that they could barely hold the spindle steady. Others apparently took to the tasks with natural grace, earning immediate approval from their new in-laws. The timing of these activities was crucial too. They happened while the guests were still relatively sober and attentive, before the evening dissolved into complete celebration chaos. This was the bride's moment to shine, to prove that her family had raised her properly, and that she deserved her place in Roman society. These first tasks weren't just performance pieces either. They established the bride's relationship with the physical space of her new home. By spinning wool in the main room, touching the household water supply, and handling the sacred fire, she claimed her territory and announced her readiness to take charge. But what happened after these public demonstrations was much more private. The evening was about to take a decidedly more intimate turn, as the couple prepared for their first night alone together, as husband and wife. The wedding feast was winding down, the guests were getting louder with each cup of wine, and the moment everyone had been anticipating was finally arriving. The locked bedroom door wasn't just about privacy, it was the grand finale of an elaborate performance that had been building all day. Only the most important guests got to witness this final act. We're talking immediate family, the closest friends, and anyone whose social status demanded they be present for every sacred moment. The rest of the crowd, they stayed outside, but trust me, they weren't going anywhere. This was when things got really interesting, and nobody wanted to miss the show. The couple didn't just casually stroll into the bedroom like modern newlyweds checking into a hotel. This was a procession with all the drama of a religious ceremony. The pronuba led the way, followed by the bride, who was supposed to look appropriately nervous and modest. The groom came next, probably trying to appear confident while dealing with his own nerves. Here's where it gets fascinating. The bedroom itself had been transformed into something resembling a shrine. Flowers covered every surface, ribbons hung from the walls. The bed, called a lectus, wasn't just furniture anymore. It had become sacred space, blessed and prepared for what Romans considered the most important moment of the entire wedding day. The selected guests didn't just peek in and leave, they had specific roles to play in this final ritual. They offered blessings, shared advice, and made sure everything was proceeding according to tradition. Some families even had prayers that were recited at this moment, asking the gods to bless the union and grant fertility to the couple. But here's what makes this whole thing uniquely Roman. The door wasn't locked to keep people out as much as it was locked to keep evil spirits from getting in. Romans believed that wedding nights were particularly vulnerable times when malevolent forces might try to curse the new marriage. That locked door was like a protective barrier, keeping the sacred space pure and safe. The guests who remained outside the locked door weren't just waiting around either, they had their own traditions to follow. Many sang songs, some beautiful and romantic, others incredibly crude and meant to embarrass the couple inside. The louder and more raucous these songs became, the more it was believed to scare away any lingering evil spirits who might want to cause trouble. Young boys often tried to listen at the door, hoping to catch some hint of what was happening inside. Married women shared knowing looks and whispered advice they wished they could give to the bride. Men made jokes and drank more wine, probably relieved they weren't the ones behind that locked door facing all that pressure and expectation. The privacy behind that door was considered absolutely sacred. Breaking it or trying to spy was not just rude, it could bring terrible luck to the entire family. Romans took this so seriously that there were actual penalties for anyone caught trying to peek or eavesdrop inappropriately. Inside the locked room, the couple faced the weight of everything their families had invested in this moment. The dowry negotiations, the months of planning, the expensive ceremony, it all came down to what happened in that private space. The pressure must have been enormous, especially for young brides who might have been teenagers with little understanding of what was expected. The bed itself was positioned to face certain directions that were considered lucky. Some families placed small statues of household gods nearby, believing their presence would bless the union and encourage fertility. Garlands of flowers weren't just decoration. Each type had specific meaning, with roses for love, myrtle for fertility, and laurel for protection. What's really striking is how this moment perfectly captured the Roman approach to marriage. Everything was about duty, family honor, and producing the next generation. Personal feelings, while not completely ignored, came second to fulfilling social obligations and religious requirements. The locked door represented the final transition from childhood to adult responsibility. Once that door closed, the bride officially became part of her husband's family. Her legal status changed, her religious duties shifted, and her primary purpose became managing a household and producing children. For the families waiting outside, this was the culmination of months or even years of planning. They'd negotiated the marriage contract, arranged the dowry, planned the ceremony, and now they could only wait and hope that everything would proceed smoothly behind that locked door. The anticipation must have been incredible. Everyone knew that what happened in that room would determine whether the marriage got off to a good start, or whether problems might plague the couple from the very beginning. But the drama wasn't over once that door finally locked. The real anxieties were just beginning, and the morning would bring its own set of expectations and traditions that would put even more pressure on the young couple. The wedding ceremony was over, the crowd had cheered, and the bedroom door had clicked shut. But what happened next wasn't exactly the romantic fairy tale we might imagine today. For many Roman brides, the wedding night brought genuine terror. Most Roman girls married incredibly young by modern standards. We're talking about teenagers, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, suddenly thrust into an adult situation they barely understood. These weren't experienced women making informed choices about their love lives, they were kids who had been playing with dolls just months earlier. Ancient Roman writers didn't sugarcoat the reality either. Ovid, that notorious poet who loved gossip, described brides trembling with fear on their wedding night. He wrote about girls who had never been alone with a man, now expected to perform intimate duties they'd only heard whispered about by older women. The terror was real, and everyone knew it. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Roman society placed crushing expectations on these young brides. The wedding night wasn't just about two people getting to know each other. It was about proving the marriage was legitimate, producing heirs for the family line, and fulfilling religious duties to ensure the gods' favor. No pressure, right? The bride's nervousness often started weeks before the actual wedding. Mothers and aunts would pull her aside for awkward conversations about what to expect. These talks rarely helped calm anyone's nerves. Instead of reassurance, brides often heard dire warnings about pain, duty, and the importance of not disappointing their new husband's family. Roman medical texts from the period reveal just how little anyone understood about making the experience comfortable for women. Doctors recommended various oils and herbs, but their advice focused more on fertility than the bride's emotional or physical well-being. The goal was babies, not happiness. Then there's the audience problem. Unlike today, where privacy is sacred, Roman wedding nights happened with half the neighborhood still partying outside. Guests sang loud songs just beyond the bedroom walls. Some of these songs were sweet, but many contained crude jokes about what was happening inside. Imagine trying to have an intimate moment while your drunk uncle bellows wedding songs in the hallway. The pressure to perform extended beyond just the couple. Families waited anxiously for signs that the marriage had been properly consummated. This wasn't considered invasive back then. It was essential proof that the legal and religious aspects of the union were complete. Privacy as we understand it simply didn't exist. Ancient letters between Roman women reveal the anxiety surrounding these nights. Mothers wrote to daughters offering last-minute advice. Sisters shared their own experiences, sometimes making things worse rather than better. The fear was so widespread that it became a common theme in Roman literature and theatre. Religious expectations made everything more intense. The Romans believed the gods watched over marriage beds, judging whether couples fulfilled their duties correctly. Priests sometimes blessed the bedroom beforehand, but this divine attention felt more like surveillance than protection to nervous brides. Getting it wrong might anger the gods and doom the entire marriage. The age gap between spouses often made things worse. While brides were typically young teenagers, grooms were frequently much older, sometimes in their 20s or 30s. These men had usually gained experience with enslaved women or prostitutes, creating a massive imbalance in knowledge and power. The innocent bride faced someone who knew exactly what he wanted, while she understood nothing. Roman philosophers occasionally criticized this system, but their concerns focused more on producing strong heirs than protecting young women's feelings. They worried that terrified brides might struggle to conceive, not that the experience itself was traumatic. The bride's emotional state mattered only as it affected her fertility. Some families tried to ease the transition by arranging meetings between the couple before the wedding night. But these chaperoned encounters hardly prepared anyone for intimacy. Most brides met their husbands for the first time during the betrothal ceremony, leaving them to figure out everything else later. The wedding night anxiety wasn't limited to brides either. Young grooms, especially those from respectable families, sometimes felt enormous pressure to prove their manhood. Their fathers and friends expected them to demonstrate competence immediately. Failure meant gossip that could damage family reputation for generations. Roman wedding night traditions revealed deep contradictions in their society. They celebrated marriage as a sacred institution while treating it like a business transaction. They honored brides as future mothers while ignoring their fears and inexperience. They demanded privacy for the couple while surrounding them with expectations and observers. These anxieties shaped how Romans thought about marriage, family, and growing up. The wedding night wasn't just a personal milestone. It was a community event with religious, legal, and social implications that affected entire family networks. Understanding these fears helps explain why Romans developed such elaborate rituals around the marriage bed itself. Every detail of that sacred space carried meaning designed to ease anxieties and ensure success. After all the ceremony, procession, and public spectacle, the newlyweds finally reached their private chamber. But even here, in what should be their most intimate moment, nothing was left to chance. The Romans had turned the wedding bed itself into a sacred symbol loaded with meaning, superstition, and family expectations. The bed, called a lectus, wasn't just furniture. Think of it as a shrine where the most important work of marriage would begin. Romans believed this piece of wood and cloth held the power to determine whether the union would produce strong heirs or fail completely. No pressure, right? Decorating the wedding bed was serious business. Families spent hours weaving ribbons through the frame, choosing colors that supposedly encouraged fertility. Red ribbons symbolized life and passion. White represented purity, though that seemed a bit late in the process. Fresh flowers were scattered across the mattress, roses for love, lilies for new beginnings, and myrtle because it was sacred to Venus, the goddess of love and sex. But here's where things get really intense. The household gods, those little statues that watched over every Roman family, were positioned around the bedroom. These weren't just decorative pieces sitting quietly in a corner. Romans genuinely believed these gods were actively observing the wedding night, taking notes on performance, and deciding whether to bless the couple with children. Talk about performance anxiety. The mattress itself was stuffed with special materials, Wealthy families used swan feathers or the softest wool. Poor families made do with straw, but they still added herbs and flowers between the layers: lavender for calm nerves, mint for fresh breath, rose petals for romance. Some families even hid small coins in the mattress, believing money would attract prosperity to the marriage. Then there's the bizarre tradition of the bed's positioning. The head of the bed had to face east, toward the rising sun, symbolizing new beginnings and the hope for dawn to bring pregnancy news. If the room's layout made this impossible, families would literally rebuild walls or move to different houses. Romans took their bedroom feng shui seriously. The most pressure-filled aspect was the expectation for immediate results. This wasn't just about consummating the marriage, it was about starting a family that very night. Roman wives were expected to become pregnant quickly, preferably with sons who could carry on the family name and inherit property. The wedding bed wasn't a place for romance or getting to know each other. It was a baby-making factory with a one-night deadline. What made this even more stressful was that privacy wasn't really private. Extended family members often stayed in nearby rooms, listening for sounds that might indicate success. Some particularly intrusive relatives would check the bedsheets the next morning for proof that the marriage was properly consummated. Modern couples complain about nosy in-laws, but Roman newlyweds dealt with actual bed inspectors. The strangest part might be the objects placed under the mattress. Families hid everything from iron nails to ward off evil spirits, to small fertility statues that were supposed to encourage pregnancy. Some beds had so many charms and amulets stuffed underneath that they probably felt like sleeping on a lumpy treasure chest. Roman literature reveals that many couples found the wedding night more terrifying than romantic. The bride, often a teenager who barely knew her husband, was expected to perform her duty while invisible gods watched and family members listened through thin walls. The groom faced pressure to prove his masculinity while surrounded by supernatural observers and superstitious rituals. Even the bedsheets carried meaning. Pure white linen was preferred, symbolizing the bride's purity, though again, the timing seemed questionable. Some families embroidered the sheets with symbols of fertility: rabbits, eggs, or grapevines. The most superstitious families changed the sheets multiple times during the night, believing fresh linens increased the chances of conception. The lectus also served as a status symbol. Wealthy families commissioned beds carved from expensive wood with ivory inlays and gold decorations. These beds were so elaborate, they looked more like altars than sleeping furniture. Poor families made do with simple wooden frames, but they still followed the decoration rituals as best they could afford. Well, the symbolic weight of the wedding bed was just the beginning. The real drama happened when a special woman, the pronoba, took control of the evening's final acts. Her role in guiding the bride through this crucial night would determine whether all these careful preparations actually worked. The bedroom door closes with a soft thud. The groom stands awkwardly by the window. The bride sits on the edge of the decorated bed, probably wondering what happens next. But they're not alone in figuring this out. Enter the pronoba, the most important woman you've never heard of in Roman wedding traditions. She's not just any married woman who wandered into the ceremony. The pronoba had to meet strict requirements that would make modern wedding planners jealous. First rule, she could only have been married once. Divorced women need not apply. Widows who remarried? Absolutely not. The Romans believed that a woman who had experienced multiple marriages might bring bad luck or confusion to the new couple. Makes sense, right? They wanted someone who represented the ideal of a single, successful marriage. The pronoba's job started hours before the bedroom scene. She guided the bride through the entire day, whispering advice about everything from how to walk gracefully to what facial expressions showed proper modesty. Think of her as part wedding coordinator, part life coach, and part good luck charm all rolled into one. But her most crucial moment came right here, at the threshold of the wedding chamber. The pronoba physically escorted the bride to the bedroom door. She didn't just point the way and wish her luck. She took the bride's arm, walked her across the room, and stood beside her as the heavy door opened. Roman writers describe this moment with surprising detail. The pronoba would lean close to the bride's ear, offering last-minute advice about the wedding night. What exactly did she whisper? Ancient texts stay frustratingly vague, but we know these conversations happened. Some historians suggest she explained what to expect physically, others think she focused on emotional preparation. The weird part is how seriously Romans took this woman's presence. They genuinely believed the pronoba's attendance could determine whether the marriage would produce children. Her successful marriage was supposed to transfer good fortune to the new couple, like some kind of fertility blessing passed from one generation to the next. Once inside the bedroom, the pronuba had one final, crucial task. She closed the door behind the couple and stood guard outside. Not to eavesdrop, though privacy wasn't exactly a Roman strong suit, but to ensure no evil spirits slipped into the room during this vulnerable moment. Roman superstition held that malicious spirits loved to interfere with wedding nights. These weren't just random ghosts looking for trouble. Specific demons supposedly targeted new brides, hoping to prevent pregnancy or cause the marriage to fail. The pronuba's presence was believed to create a protective barrier against these supernatural threats. Then there's the practical side of her duties. The pronuba made sure the bedroom was properly prepared according to ancient custom. She checked that the marriage bed faced the right direction, east, toward the rising sun for fertility and new beginnings. She verified that protective amulets were hidden in the correct spots around the room. Some Roman families gave their pronuba additional responsibilities that sound almost medical by today's standards. She might inspect the bedsheets the morning after, looking for proof that the marriage had been consummated. This wasn't just nosiness, it was considered legal evidence that the union was valid and complete. The social pressure on the pronuba was intense. If the marriage failed to produce children within a reasonable time, people sometimes blamed her for not performing her duties correctly. If the couple divorced, neighbors might whisper that she hadn't chosen the right words during her bedroom advice session. But successful marriages boosted the pronuba's reputation enormously. Families would compete to have a particularly lucky pronuba attend their daughters' weddings. Some women built entire social careers around being the go-to pronuba for wealthy Roman families. The role came with genuine risks too. Being present during such intimate family moments meant the pronuba learned secrets that could destroy reputations. Roman law actually included specific penalties for pronubas who gossiped about what they witnessed or overheard during wedding nights. Ancient Roman comedy plays sometimes mocked the pronuba tradition, suggesting that some women in this role were busybodies who enjoyed meddling in other people's private affairs. But even the jokes showed how central this figure was to Roman marriage customs. The strangest part, the pronuba tradition lasted for centuries, surviving even as other Roman wedding customs evolved or disappeared. Something about having an experienced married woman guide new brides through their first night of marriage clearly resonated with Roman society's deepest values about family, fertility, and female wisdom. After the pronuba finally left the couple alone, and the bedroom door stayed closed for the night, the real celebration could begin outside. The guests had been waiting patiently, or not so patiently, for this moment to start the rowdiest part of any Roman wedding. Evil spirits were everywhere on a Roman wedding night, at least according to anxious families. These invisible troublemakers supposedly lurked in dark corners, waiting to curse the new couple or steal their future happiness. Romans took this threat seriously, very seriously. The pronuba carried small iron amulets in her robes, ready to place them strategically around the bedroom. Iron was considered the ultimate spirit repellent. Why iron? Ancient Romans believed spirits hated the metal because it came from deep underground, closer to the realm of the dead. Makes sense in their twisted logic, right? Garlic cloves hung from door frames like tiny smelly guardians. The stronger the smell, the better the protection. Fresh garlic worked best, though some families used dried cloves that had been blessed by priests. Guests sometimes complained about the overwhelming stench, but superstition trumped comfort every time. Then there were the more dramatic protective measures. Family members would spit 3 times over their left shoulder before entering the bedroom area. This wasn't casual spitting either. It required proper technique and timing. The saliva had to hit the ground in exactly the right pattern, or the charm wouldn't work. Well, at least that's what the old wives claimed. Some brides wore tiny bronze phallus charms hidden beneath their wedding clothes. These weren't meant to be erotic. They were protective symbols against the evil eye. The Romans believed jealous spirits became particularly active when witnessing human happiness, especially the intimate joy of newlyweds. The phallic amulets were supposed to confuse and repel these envious supernatural beings. Let's not forget the mysterious practice of hiding bread crusts under the wedding bed. Stale bread, specifically. The logic. Evil spirits would become distracted trying to figure out why anyone would store old bread in such an odd location. While the spirits puzzled over this mystery, the couple could consummate their marriage in peace. But the weird part is how families coordinated these superstitious activities. The bride's mother usually handled the garlic placement, while the groom's family managed the iron amulets. The pranuba supervised the spitting rituals. Everyone had a role in this supernatural defense system. Special incantations were whispered during the protection setup. These weren't formal prayers, they were folk magic passed down through generations. Malum spirits, begone from this sacred place, mothers might mutter while arranging garlic cloves. Let love flourish where hatred cannot reach. Some families hired professional charm makers to create personalized protective spells. These specialists claimed they could tailor supernatural defenses to specific family bloodlines or regional spirit threats. For the right price, they'd even guarantee their charms would work for a full year after the wedding. The bedroom itself became a fortress of superstitious objects. Rose petals scattered on the floor weren't just romantic decoration, they were believed to create a barrier that evil spirits couldn't cross. Certain flowers had specific protective properties: white roses for purity, red roses for passionate love, yellow roses to confuse malicious entities. And the weird part is how seriously everyone treated these rituals. Nobody laughed or rolled their eyes. Even educated Romans who understood philosophy and mathematics participated in these supernatural precautions. Fear of spiritual interference outweighed rational skepticism. Sacred oils were dabbed on window frames and door hinges. These weren't expensive perfumed oils. They were simple olive oil that had been blessed in temples dedicated to Juno, goddess of marriage. The oil created an invisible protective film that spirits supposedly couldn't penetrate. Some families performed the mirror trick, placing polished bronze mirrors face down around the bedroom. The theory was that evil spirits would become trapped trying to enter their own reflections, leaving the couple undisturbed. Creative supernatural logic, you have to admit. Then there were the verbal charms spoken directly to potential spiritual threats. "We welcome only love and fertility to this chamber," the pranuba might declare while lighting protective candles. "All other forces must depart immediately." These weren't requests, they were commands delivered with absolute authority. Children from both families sometimes participated by drawing protective symbols in the dirt outside the house. These crude chalk marks were supposed to create additional barriers against supernatural interference. The symbols varied by region, but circles, crosses, and intertwined spirals appeared frequently. The most elaborate families hired musicians to play specific melodies believed to repel evil spirits. Not just any music would work. The songs had to follow traditional patterns that spirits allegedly found unbearable. These protective concerts sometimes lasted until dawn. But here's what made these superstitions particularly interesting. They actually served a practical psychological purpose. All this ritualistic preparation helped calm nervous families and gave everyone something concrete to do with their wedding night anxieties. Yet the Romans didn't see it that way. For them, these weren't just comforting activities, they were essential spiritual warfare. The success of the marriage, the health of future children, even the family's long-term prosperity could depend on proper supernatural protection. While families battled invisible spirits with garlic and iron, the celebration outside continued with increasingly loud music and increasingly crude songs. The contrast between sacred bedroom protection and raucous party atmosphere created a uniquely Roman wedding night experience. While the newlyweds disappeared behind closed doors, their wedding night was far from private. The real party was just getting started outside their bedroom, and Roman wedding guests knew how to make noise. The celebration that followed the couple's retreat became a raucous affair that would make modern neighbors call the police. Guests gathered in the courtyard and surrounding rooms, armed with wine cups and endless verses of increasingly crude wedding songs. These weren't sweet lullabies wishing the couple sweet dreams. Roman wedding songs were designed to be heard through walls, and they packed a punch that would make sailors blush. The songs served multiple purposes beyond simple entertainment. Romans believed that loud, boisterous singing scared away evil spirits who might try to curse the marriage bed. The louder and more outrageous the songs, the better the protection. Guests competed to see who could come up with the most creative verses, often making up lyrics on the spot that referenced the bride and groom's families, their appearance, or their supposed bedroom skills. Wine flowed freely during these extended celebrations. Roman hosts took pride in providing quality wine for wedding festivities, and guests took full advantage. The drinking wasn't just for fun, it was considered essential for creating the proper celebratory atmosphere that would bless the new marriage. Drunk wedding guests were seen as enthusiastic supporters of the union, and their loud approval supposedly brought good luck to the couple. But here's where things got really interesting. Some guests actually tried to spy on the newlyweds. Peering through keyholes, listening at doors, and attempting to catch glimpses through windows became part of the evening's entertainment. This wasn't considered rude or invasive by Roman standards. It was seen as showing proper interest in the marriage's success. The wedding songs grew progressively more explicit as the night wore on and the wine took effect. Guests sang about fertility, sexual prowess, and the bride's transition from virgin to wife. These songs often contained advice, warnings, and encouragement directed at both partners. Some verses made fun of the groom's nervousness or the bride's inexperience, while others offered practical suggestions that we probably can't repeat in polite company today. Musicians kept the party going with drums, flutes, and lyres. The music grew louder as the night progressed, creating a soundtrack that could be heard throughout the neighborhood. Romans believed this musical celebration needed to last most of the night to properly honor the marriage and ensure the gods' continued blessing on the union. Children who attended the wedding often fell asleep during these extended festivities, but the adults kept going. Older relatives shared stories about their own wedding nights, comparing traditions and offering commentary on how things had changed over the years. These conversations revealed details about Roman intimate life that were rarely discussed in other social settings. Food continued to be served throughout the night, though by this point it was mostly simple fare designed to soak up the wine. Bread, cheese, olives, and dried fruits kept guests from drinking on completely empty stomachs. Servants moved through the crowd, refilling cups and clearing away dishes, while trying to prevent the celebration from getting too out of hand. The songs often included references to Roman gods and goddesses associated with love and fertility. Venus, Juno, and Priapus were frequently mentioned in verses that asked for their blessing on the couple's physical union. These religious references weren't considered blasphemous. They were seen as proper prayers set to music. Some wedding guests brought musical instruments of their own, turning the celebration into an impromptu concert. Guests took turns performing, with each trying to outdo the previous singer in volume, creativity, or outrageousness. The competitive nature of these performances kept the energy high throughout the night. As dawn approached, the singing often reached its loudest point. This final burst of noise was intended to greet the sunrise and celebrate the couple's successful completion of their first night as husband and wife. The timing was crucial. The songs needed to continue until there were clear signs that morning had arrived. The celebration only began to wind down when the first servants started appearing to begin their morning duties. Even then, some dedicated guests continued singing until they either passed out from exhaustion or were physically escorted from the premises by household slaves. Roman wedding night festivities created bonds between the families that would last for years. Guests remembered who sang the cleverest songs, who drank the most wine, and who provided the best entertainment. These shared memories became part of family folklore, told and retold at future gatherings. The singing and drinking were just the beginning of what made Roman wedding nights memorable. The morning after brought its own set of customs and expectations that were just as important as the previous evening's celebration. The wedding night was over, but the drama, just getting started. Roman families didn't just send their newlyweds off into married bliss and hope for the best. They wanted proof, real tangible evidence that the marriage had been properly consummated. Privacy might have been protected during the actual night, but come morning, everyone expected some kind of confirmation that things had gone according to plan. This wasn't about being nosy for the sake of it. Marriage in Rome carried massive legal and social weight. The union needed to be legitimate in every sense, and that included the physical completion of the bond. Without consummation, a marriage could be questioned, annulled, or challenged by rival family members looking to cause trouble. The stakes were too high to leave anything to chance. How exactly did families verify this delicate matter? Romans developed a surprisingly sophisticated system of subtle checks and symbolic gestures. The couple didn't have to submit to embarrassing examinations or public declarations. Instead, they participated in mourning rituals that communicated the success of their union through coded actions and gift exchanges. The bride often received special jewelry or ornaments the morning after her wedding night. These weren't random presents. They served as tokens acknowledging her transition from virgin bride to married woman. A particular necklace, bracelet, or hair ornament might be presented by her new mother-in-law, symbolizing acceptance into the family and recognition of the completed marriage bond. The gift itself became a kind of proof, displayed proudly to visiting relatives and friends. Then there were the more practical considerations. Bed sheets and clothing could provide evidence without anyone having to ask uncomfortable questions directly. The pronuba, that important married woman who had guided the bride to her wedding chamber, might discreetly check these items and report back to the anxious mothers. Roman society had developed ways to handle these matters with as much dignity as possible, while still satisfying family concerns. The morning also brought an influx of guests bearing practical gifts for the new household, but timing mattered enormously here. Relatives and friends would arrive with cooking pots, furniture, linens, and other domestic necessities, only after receiving some signal that the marriage had been successfully completed. Showing up too early could be seen as presumptuous or unlucky. Arriving at just the right moment demonstrated social awareness and respect for the couple's privacy. These gift-giving sessions served multiple purposes beyond just stocking the new home. They provided opportunities for family members to observe the couple's demeanor and interaction. A blushing bride who stayed close to her new husband sent different signals than one who seemed distant or upset. The groom's behavior mattered too. Roman men were expected to show protective care for their new wives while maintaining dignified composure. Some families organized special breakfast gatherings where the newlyweds would appear together for the first time as a fully married couple. The bride might wear her hair differently, styled in the elaborate arrangements reserved for married women rather than the simpler braids of maidens. Her clothing choices also communicated her new status. These visual cues told the assembled relatives everything they needed to know without requiring explicit confirmation. Religious elements played into the morning after rituals as well. Couples often made offerings to household gods, thanking them for protection during the vulnerable wedding night, and requesting continued blessings for their marriage. These ceremonies required both partners to participate actively, demonstrating their unity and the successful completion of their union. Priests might examine the couple's offerings or behavior for signs of divine approval. The pressure on young brides during these morning presentations must have been intense. Many were still teenagers, dealing with the physical and emotional aftermath of their wedding night, while also needing to perform their new roles convincingly for critical family audiences. Roman society expected them to show appropriate modesty, while also radiating the confidence of successful wives. Wealthy families sometimes commissioned special artwork or commissioned poets to create commemorative pieces celebrating the successful union. These weren't created until after the marriage had been verified as complete and proper. A hastily commissioned poem or expensive vase served as both celebration and subtle announcement that everything had proceeded correctly. Regional variations existed in how families handled these delicate verifications. Some areas favored more direct approaches, while others developed elaborate symbolic systems that could communicate the necessary information through seemingly innocent social interactions. The basic need remained constant across the Roman world, but local customs shaped the specific methods. Well, these morning after rituals reveal just how seriously Romans took the institution of marriage. Every detail mattered, from the legal implications to the family honor at stake. But all this focus on proof and verification points to something even more fundamental about Roman society. The success of individual marriages wasn't just personal business. It directly impacted the broader goal that drove every Roman family's deepest hopes and fears. After all the ceremony, the veil lifting, the threshold crossing, and that nerve-wracking first night, Roman couples faced the real reason everyone had gathered to celebrate: children. Not just any children, legitimate heirs who could carry on the family name, inherit property, and keep the bloodline alive. Marriage without children was like buying an expensive chariot with no horses. Sure, it looked impressive, but what was the point? Roman families didn't invest in elaborate weddings, negotiate complex dowries, and perform sacred rituals just so two people could live together happily. They wanted babies, lots of them. The pressure started immediately. While modern couples might enjoy a few years to themselves, Roman newlyweds had relatives asking about pregnancy before the wedding decorations were even cleaned up. Mothers-in-law would scrutinize the bride's appearance for signs of morning sickness. Fathers counted months on their fingers, hoping for good news. But here's where things get interesting. Romans weren't just desperate for any children, they needed sons. Daughters were lovely, sure, but sons carried the family name forward. Sons inherited the bulk of the estate. Sons performed the religious duties that kept dead ancestors happy in the afterlife. A family with only daughters faced a slow extinction of their lineage. This obsession with male heirs created some awkward situations. Wealthy Roman men might divorce perfectly wonderful wives simply because they hadn't produced sons, never mind that the husband might be the one with fertility issues. Medical knowledge back then was, shall we say, limited. The wife always got the blame. Then there's the sheer numbers game. Roman women were expected to have multiple children because so many died young. Diseases that we barely think about today could wipe out entire families. Parents needed backup children, and backups for the backups. Having just 1 or 2 kids was considered risky family planning. Childless couples faced serious social consequences. Neighbors whispered about them at the market. Religious leaders suggested they had somehow offended the gods. Extended family members might start eyeing the couple's property, wondering who would inherit it. The stigma was real and relentless. Let's not forget the religious angle. Romans believed their ancestors were still hanging around, watching from the afterlife. These ghostly relatives needed living descendants to make offerings and perform rituals on their behalf. No children meant no one to tend the family shrine. Dead ancestors would be seriously annoyed about that. Desperate couples tried everything to boost their fertility. They visited temples dedicated to fertility gods and goddesses. They wore special amulets. They followed bizarre diets recommended by so-called experts. Some women even slept with statues of pregnant goddesses, hoping for divine intervention. The weird part is that some of these practices probably worked, not because of magic, but because reducing stress and anxiety can actually improve fertility. Roman law even got involved in this baby-making business. Augustus, one of Rome's most famous emperors, passed laws encouraging marriage and childbearing. Single people and childless couples faced tax penalties. Parents with multiple children got legal advantages. The government was literally bribing people to reproduce. But here's something that might surprise you. Roman parents could legally reject their newborn babies. If a child was born with disabilities, or if the family already had too many daughters, the father could refuse to acknowledge the baby. This sounds horrific to us today, but it was perfectly normal in ancient Rome. Families had to be practical about resources. The flip side of this harsh reality was that accepted children were genuinely wanted and celebrated. Roman parents who chose to raise a child were making a serious commitment. They threw naming ceremonies, commissioned portraits, and invested heavily in their children's education and future prospects. Pregnancy itself was treated as a community event. Pregnant women received special treatment and protection. Everyone from neighbors to slaves had opinions about what the expectant mother should eat, how she should sleep, and which gods she should pray to. Privacy wasn't really an option. The actual birth was women's business exclusively. Men were kicked out while mothers, sisters, midwives, and female slaves took charge. These birth attendants had their own rituals and superstitions. They burned specific herbs, chanted protective spells, and carefully positioned lucky charms around the laboring woman. Multiple births were considered either incredibly lucky or terribly ominous, depending on the circumstances. Twins might be seen as a divine blessing or a supernatural curse. The family's reaction often depended on their current financial situation and how many children they already had. Roman mothers who successfully produced several healthy children, especially sons, gained enormous respect and social status. They were seen as having fulfilled their most important duty. Their tombstones would proudly list how many children they had raised to adulthood. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that creating these much-wanted heirs was exactly what made that wedding night so intimidating for many young brides. The celebration, the ceremony, the social pressure, it all came down to this fundamental biological purpose that would define their entire adult lives. Nobody talks about what happened when Roman marriages fell apart. But here's the thing, divorce in ancient Rome wasn't some scandalous modern invention. The Romans had it figured out centuries before anyone else, though they certainly didn't make it easy. Early in the Republic, divorce was rarer than an honest politician, but by the late Empire, some Romans were switching spouses faster than they changed their togas. The legal framework existed from the beginning. Both partners could initiate divorce, which was revolutionary for its time. Women had actual rights in this process, something that would disappear in many cultures for centuries afterward. But here's where it gets interesting. The reasons for divorce weren't always what you'd expect. Adultery was obvious grounds, but so was failing to produce children, being too fond of wine, or even making copies of your husband's house keys without permission. Romans took their domestic security seriously. Divorce proceedings were surprisingly straightforward. No lengthy court battles or dramatic scenes in the forum. The couple simply had to declare their intention to divorce in front of 7 adult Roman citizens. That's it. The magic phrase was "keep your things to yourself." Tires res tibi habito, and suddenly you were back on the marriage market. The dowry system we discussed earlier actually made this process smoother, since the wife's family got their investment back. minus any deductions for her bad behavior. Then there's the matter of death, which solved more marriage problems than divorce ever did. Life expectancy wasn't exactly impressive in ancient Rome. Women often died in childbirth, men died in wars, and everyone died from diseases that wouldn't even keep us home from work today. When your spouse died, mourning periods were strictly regulated. Widows had to wait 10 months before remarrying, officially to ensure any pregnancy could be properly attributed to the deceased husband, but also to show proper respect for the dead. Widowers faced different rules entirely. Men could remarry almost immediately, especially if they had young children who needed a mother. Roman society valued practical solutions over emotional healing. A man with a household to run and a business to manage couldn't afford to stay single long. Besides, bachelor life wasn't really socially acceptable for Roman men of any standing. Second marriages were incredibly common, and the wedding ceremonies were notably different from first-time affairs. The elaborate rituals we've been exploring, the dramatic farewells, the ritual kidnapping, the pronuba's involvement, these were primarily for virgin brides. Second-time brides, whether divorced or widowed, had simpler ceremonies, no orange veils or complex hair braiding. They'd already proven they could handle married life. But here's where Roman pragmatism gets fascinating. Second marriages were often even more calculated than first ones. A widow with children from her first marriage brought a complicated package deal. Her new husband gained stepchildren, who legally belonged to their deceased father's family, creating intricate webs of obligation and inheritance. Smart Romans used these situations to build massive family networks that spanned multiple generations and social classes. The children from previous marriages created unique dynamics. Roman law was crystal clear about inheritance rights and family loyalty. Your biological father's family always came first, regardless of how wonderful your stepfather might be. This meant some Roman households had children with divided loyalties, different legal statuses, and competing inheritance claims all living under one roof. Family dinners must have been interesting. Divorce also revealed the true purpose of Roman marriage. It was never about love or personal happiness. When marriages dissolved, families immediately started calculating losses and gains, which political alliances were broken, which business partnerships needed renegotiation, which social connections were now awkward. The actual emotional impact on the couple involved was often an afterthought. Women in particular faced harsh realities after divorce. A divorced woman could remarry, but her reputation took a hit regardless of who initiated the split. Roman society whispered about women who couldn't keep their husbands satisfied, even when the divorce happened, because the husband was gambling away the family fortune or sleeping with half the neighborhood. Unfair doesn't begin to cover it. The most successful Romans often had multiple marriages throughout their lives. Julius Caesar had 3 wives. Augustus had 3 as well, divorcing his second wife while she was pregnant to marry his third. These weren't romantic choices, they were career moves. Each new marriage brought fresh political opportunities, new family connections, and different strategic advantages. What's remarkable is how efficiently Roman society absorbed these relationship changes. Modern divorce often traumatizes entire extended families for years. Romans seem to view marriage dissolution as another business transaction that required proper documentation and fair distribution of assets. Clean, practical, and emotionally cold. The legal documents tracking these complex family relationships became incredibly sophisticated. Roman records had to account for children from multiple marriages, property transfers between divorced spouses, and inheritance rights that crossed several family lines. These weren't just marriages, they were corporate mergers and acquisitions. While Romans perfected the logistics of marriage dissolution, they also created elaborate systems for new beginnings. The scandalous celebrity weddings that rocked Roman society show us just how dramatic these corporate mergers could become. When Julius Caesar's daughter Julia married Pompey in 59 BCE, half of Rome showed up to gawk. The wedding wasn't just a family affair, it was a political spectacle designed to cement an alliance between 2 of the most powerful men in the Republic. Caesar spared no expense, flooding the streets with wine and turning the entire event into a massive public festival. Everyone knew this wasn't about love. Julia was basically a human contract, sealing her father's political ambitions with wedding vows. The guest list read like a who's who of Roman power brokers. Senators, generals, and wealthy merchants all crowded into Caesar's villa, each one calculating how this marriage might affect their own fortunes. The bride and groom, they were almost afterthoughts in their own ceremony. Julia had met Pompey exactly 3 times before their wedding day. Romance wasn't on the agenda. empire building was. But the real drama unfolded during Emperor Claudius's wedding to Valeria Messalina. This woman turned the imperial palace into her personal playground, and their wedding night became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Messalina had a reputation that would make modern tabloids blush. She supposedly challenged Rome's most experienced prostitute to a contest and won. On her wedding night with Claudius, guests whispered that she was already planning her next affair before the ceremony ended. Then there's the story that really shocked Roman society. Messalina later married her lover Gaius Silius while still wed to the emperor. The wedding ceremony happened in full view of hundreds of witnesses, complete with all the traditional rituals we've been discussing. Problem was, she forgot to mention this little detail to her actual husband. When Claudius found out, heads literally rolled. Silius was executed, and Messalina met a similar fate. Emperor Nero took wedding scandals to an entirely different level. His marriage to Pompeia Sabina started with him kicking his pregnant wife Octavia to death, then waiting exactly the appropriate mourning period before remarrying. Roman law required specific timing between marriages, and Nero followed every technicality while completely ignoring basic human decency. The wedding itself was lavish beyond belief, golden decorations, exotic animals, and entertainment that lasted for days. What made these imperial weddings particularly scandalous was how they twisted traditional Roman values. Remember those sacred rituals about family honor and social order? Emperors used them as props in their political theater. They'd perform the solemn vow ceremonies, eat the sacred far cake, and complete all the proper religious observances while everyone in attendance knew the whole thing was a sham. Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra's wedding created an international incident. When Antony married the Egyptian queen, he didn't just break Roman marriage customs, he shattered them completely. Roman citizens were supposed to marry Roman citizens, not foreign royalty with their own armies. The wedding ceremony reportedly blended Roman and Egyptian traditions, creating a hybrid ritual that horrified traditionalists back in Rome. Octavian used this scandalous marriage as propaganda ammunition, painting Antony as a traitor to Roman values. Let's not forget Emperor Caligula, who managed to turn every wedding he touched into a circus. He once interrupted someone else's wedding ceremony, declared the bride too beautiful for her groom, and married her himself on the spot. The original groom had to sit there and watch his bride complete the sacred cake ceremony with the emperor instead. Caligula divorced her 2 weeks later, apparently bored with his impulsive decision. The wedding night stories from these famous couples became the stuff of Roman gossip for generations. Servants would leak details about what happened behind closed doors, and poets would turn these whispered scandals into popular entertainment. Some emperors actually encouraged the gossip, using their wedding night exploits as a way to project power and virility to the masses. Wealthy Roman families often tried to copy imperial wedding extravagance, leading to increasingly ridiculous competitions. One senator reportedly spent his entire family fortune on his daughter's wedding, importing rare birds from Africa, just to release them during the ceremony. Another family hired professional actors to play all the traditional roles, turning sacred rituals into elaborate performances. These scandalous weddings reveal something fascinating about Roman society. Even when the powerful completely corrupted traditional marriage customs, they still felt compelled to perform them. The rituals we've explored throughout this series were so deeply embedded in Roman culture that even the most rebellious emperors couldn't simply ignore them. They had to twist them, corrupt them, or exaggerate them, but they couldn't escape them entirely. Behind all these public spectacles and political machinations, though, were real people following ancient customs that most Romans never saw. While emperors turned weddings into propaganda tools, ordinary couples were performing intimate rituals that had been passed down through families for generations. The public ceremonies were over, the guests had retreated, and the locked bedroom door separated the newlyweds from the celebrating crowd outside. But what happened behind that door involved more than just two nervous people figuring out married life. Ancient Romans believed the wedding night was when invisible forces were most active, and couples performed secret rituals that no historian was invited to document. The bride often began with a private prayer to Juno, the goddess of marriage and childbirth. She'd whisper her hopes for children, for happiness, and for protection from the dangers of pregnancy. These weren't the formal, witnessed prayers from the ceremony. These were personal pleas, spoken in hushed tones while touching small amulets or sacred objects brought from her childhood home. The groom might pray too, usually to Jupiter for strength and to the household gods for prosperity. Makes sense, right? The pressure was enormous. But the weird part is how many couples believed their dreams from the first night would predict their entire marriage. Some families passed down the tradition of keeping a wax tablet next to the wedding bed. When morning came, both bride and groom would scratch down whatever they remembered dreaming. These dream records were sometimes kept for years, consulted during difficult times or when making important family decisions. A dream about eagles meant future sons would be strong. Water dreams suggested daughters. Nightmares about fire or blood, well, those tablets often got buried in the garden. Sacred statues played a bigger role than most people realize. Wealthy Roman families placed small bronze or marble figures of protective deities right in the bedroom. Not just decoration, active spiritual guardians. The bride might touch the statue of Diana for help with childbirth, while the groom honored Mars for courage. These weren't the grand public statues you'd see in temples. These were intimate, personal gods, often inherited through generations of marriages. Let's not forget the fertility rituals that happened away from prying eyes. The bride sometimes wore a special belt or cord under her wedding dress, woven by her mother or grandmother with specific knots. During the private moments before joining her husband, she'd untie these knots while reciting family prayers for pregnancy. Each knot represented a hoped-for child. The untied cord would be placed under the mattress or pillow, where it stayed until the first pregnancy was confirmed. Some couples wrote secret vows to each other, completely separate from the public ceremony. These personal promises were scratched onto thin lead sheets, then rolled up and hidden in cracks in the bedroom walls. Archaeologists have found dozens of these private wedding vows, and they're often much more emotional than the formal words spoken during the ceremony. May your beauty never fade in my eyes. Promise you'll forgive my fears. Let us grow old together without cruelty. The contrast with public Roman stoicism is striking. Then there were the protective rituals against evil spirits. The bride might scatter iron nails around the bed's perimeter, because Romans believed demons couldn't cross iron barriers. Salt was sprinkled in the corners of the room. The groom sometimes drew invisible circles in the air with his finger, muttering protective formulas taught by his father. These weren't official religious practices. They were folk magic, passed down through families and adapted to personal beliefs. The strangest private ritual involved mirror magic. Some brides brought small bronze mirrors to the wedding bed, not for vanity, but for spiritual protection. They believed looking into the mirror while making their first vows as a wife would trap any evil spirits trying to possess them. The mirror would then be wrapped in cloth and stored away, never to be used for ordinary purposes again. If the marriage turned out happy, the mirror was considered blessed. If not, it got smashed and buried. Individual families developed their own unique traditions over generations. Some required the couple to share a cup of wine mixed with honey and herbs before consummating the marriage. Others insisted on burning specific types of incense or placing certain flowers under the pillow. One wealthy Roman family's tomb inscription mentions a tradition where newlyweds had to each eat 7 grapes while making 7 silent wishes. Though what those wishes typically involved remains a mystery. But why did these private rituals matter so much? Roman marriages carried enormous social, economic, and political weight. The wedding night represented the moment when all those public promises became intensely personal reality. The secret rituals gave couples some sense of control over forces much bigger than themselves. Family expectations, financial pressures, the terrifying prospect of childbirth, and the mysteries of intimate life. These hidden ceremonies reveal how deeply Romans understood that marriage was both a public institution and a private emotional reality. While guests celebrated outside and families congratulated themselves on successful negotiations, 2 individuals faced each other in lamplight, surrounded by generations of hopes, fears, and protective magic. The morning would bring new responsibilities and public scrutiny, but that first night belonged entirely to the couple and their secret rituals. Roman writers loved their drama. They couldn't resist turning wedding nights into literary goldmines, spinning tales that were sometimes tender, often shocking, and occasionally downright hilarious. These ancient authors gave us a peek behind the bedroom doors of Roman society, though you had to read between the lines to separate fact from fiction. Ovid was probably the most shameless when it came to wedding night stories. His poems described nervous brides who trembled like leaves and grooms who fumbled around like they'd never seen a woman before. He wrote about one bride who supposedly hid under the bed until her husband coaxed her out with honey cakes. Whether this actually happened or was just Ovid being Ovid is anyone's guess, but Romans ate these stories up like candy. Then there's Catullus, who took a completely different approach. His wedding poems were raw and honest about the physical side of marriage. He didn't sugarcoat anything. One of his most famous pieces described a bride's fear so vividly that readers could practically feel her heart pounding. He wrote about tears, trembling hands, and the awkward silence that filled Roman bedrooms on wedding nights. Modern readers might find his descriptions uncomfortable, but they give us an unfiltered look at what these young women actually experienced. Pliny the Younger preferred the romantic angle. His letters described wedding nights as beautiful moments of connection between husband and wife. He wrote about couples who spent their first night talking until dawn, sharing dreams and hopes for their future together. Pliny's version was probably the exception rather than the rule, but it shows that not every Roman wedding night was a traumatic ordeal. The playwright Terence had a field day with wedding night comedy. His characters included grooms who got so nervous they threw up, brides who locked themselves in closets, and mothers-in-law who barged in at the worst possible moments. Roman audiences howled with laughter at these scenes because they recognized the truth in them. Wedding nights were often messy, awkward affairs that didn't go according to plan. Martial, the master of sarcastic poetry, took aim at the pretentious aspects of Roman wedding nights. He mocked families who spent fortunes on elaborate bedroom decorations while ignoring the terror of their teenage daughters. One of his poems described a wedding bed so covered in flowers that the couple couldn't find each other. Another poked fun at a groom who was more interested in showing off his expensive sheets than paying attention to his bride. But the real eye-opener comes from Juvenal, whose satirical poems pulled no punches. He described wedding nights where young brides were essentially sacrificed to family ambitions. His writing revealed the dark side of Roman marriage customs, showing how political and financial concerns trampled over human feelings. Juvenal's brides weren't romantic heroines, they were victims of a system that treated them like property. Female writers offered a different perspective entirely. Sulpicia, one of the few Roman women whose poetry survived, wrote about wedding nights from the bride's point of view. Her verses described the loneliness and confusion that many young women felt. She wrote about lying awake next to a stranger, wondering if this was what the rest of her life would look like. Her honesty was refreshing in a literary world dominated by male voices. These writers also captured the superstitions that surrounded Roman wedding nights. Stories described mysterious sounds in the bedroom, unexplained cold spots, and strange dreams that supposedly predicted the couple's future. One tale involved a bride who saw the ghost of her husband's first wife standing at the foot of the bed. Whether anyone actually believed these stories is unclear, but they reflected the very real anxieties that Romans felt about marriage and intimacy. The influence of these wedding night stories spread far beyond Rome. Medieval writers borrowed heavily from Roman themes, and Renaissance poets rediscovered these ancient texts with enthusiasm. Even today, wedding night anxiety remains a common theme in literature, though modern writers tend to be more explicit than their Roman predecessors ever dared to be. What makes these ancient stories particularly valuable is how they contradict the official version of Roman marriage. While laws and customs painted marriage as a smooth, predetermined process, literature revealed the human messiness underneath. These writers showed us that Romans struggled with the same fears, hopes, and disappointments that couples face today. The most surprising thing about Roman wedding night literature might be how it evolved over time. Early writers focused on duty and family honor, but later authors became more interested in individual feelings and personal experience. This shift reflected broader changes in Roman society as the empire matured and absorbed influences from other cultures. Yet for all their dramatic flair, these ancient writers captured something essential about the Roman wedding night experience. They understood that behind all the rituals, decorations, and family politics were two real people trying to figure out how to build a life together. The stories these writers told would continue to shape expectations about marriage long after the Roman Empire fell, but the customs themselves were already beginning to transform in ways that would surprise even the most creative ancient authors. Roman wedding night traditions weren't frozen in time like ancient statues, they shifted and evolved just like everything else in Roman society. What started as strict religious ceremonies slowly loosened their grip on couples over the centuries. During the early Republic, those wedding night rituals we've been exploring were taken deadly seriously. Every gesture mattered, every superstition carried weight. The pronuba absolutely had to be there, the sacred bed required specific decorations, families watched for signs and omens like hawks circling prey. Breaking any tradition could spell disaster for the marriage. But here's where things get interesting. As Rome grew from a small city-state into a massive empire, wedding customs started bending under pressure. Wealth changed everything. rich families began hiring professional wedding planners instead of relying on elder women to organize ceremonies. The personal touch disappeared when money entered the picture. Military campaigns also disrupted traditional patterns. Soldiers married women from conquered territories who had completely different wedding customs. Roman men stationed in Britain, Gaul or Egypt picked up local traditions and brought them home. Suddenly Roman bedrooms were mixing Italian superstitions with Celtic charms and Egyptian fertility rituals. Then Christianity arrived and flipped the script entirely. Early Christian leaders looked at Roman wedding night practices with deep suspicion. All those household gods watching over the marriage bed, gone, the sacred statues in bedrooms, removed, prayer offerings to Jupiter for fertility, replaced with appeals to the Christian god. The pronuba's role as a lucky charm gradually faded because Christians believed divine blessing came through prayer, not through the presence of previously married women. Christian ideas about marriage fundamentally changed the wedding night's meaning. Romans originally saw the first night as a contractual seal between families, focused on producing heirs and joining fortunes. Christians emphasized the spiritual bond between husband and wife as individuals. Love became more important than family alliances. The weird part is how long some superstitions survived this religious transformation. Christian Roman brides still worried about stumbling when entering their new homes. They continued throwing nuts at weddings for good luck. Evil eye charms found their way into Christian ceremonies, just disguised as saints' medals or crosses. Old habits die hard, especially when they involve protecting something as precious as a new marriage. Medieval Europe inherited these mixed traditions like a complicated family recipe passed down through generations. Italian weddings in the 1200s still featured elements recognizable from ancient Rome. Brides wore veils, couples shared special foods, and families organized elaborate processions. The core structure remained, even though the religious meaning had completely changed. Economic shifts also transformed wedding night expectations. As trade expanded across Europe, merchant families gained influence over old aristocratic bloodlines. Wealthy traders couldn't claim ancient Roman ancestry, but they could afford spectacular wedding celebrations. Money replaced bloodline as the primary marker of social status. This meant wedding customs became more about showing off wealth than following sacred traditions. Let's not forget how literacy changed everything. During the Roman Empire, most people couldn't read or write. Wedding traditions passed through oral storytelling, which meant details shifted with each telling. Once books became more common in medieval times, wedding customs got written down and standardized. The flexibility that allowed Roman traditions to evolve naturally became much more restricted. Legal systems evolved too. Roman marriage law was surprisingly sophisticated, but it focused heavily on property rights and family obligations. Medieval Christian law emphasized the couple's personal consent and spiritual commitment. This shift meant wedding nights became less about fulfilling family contracts and more about expressing individual devotion. Regional differences became more pronounced over time. What worked for Roman families in sunny Italy didn't necessarily fit Germanic tribes in cold northern forests. Local customs gradually overwhelmed imported Roman traditions. German wedding customs emphasized community celebration over family privacy. Nordic traditions included entirely different symbols for fertility and protection. The fascinating thing is how some Roman elements survived in completely unexpected ways. Modern Italian weddings still feature elaborate processions reminiscent of ancient Roman parades. Throwing rice at newlyweds echoes those old nut-throwing customs. Carrying brides over thresholds remains popular across Europe and America, directly descended from Roman superstitions about evil spirits. Even the timing of weddings shows Roman influence. Avoiding May weddings was a Roman superstition that lasted well into the Renaissance. June became the most popular wedding month, partly because Romans considered it lucky. These scheduling preferences had nothing to do with weather or practical concerns. They were pure Roman superstition dressed up in medieval clothing. Roman wedding night anxieties also evolved in unexpected directions. Ancient Roman brides worried about angering household gods or inviting bad luck. Medieval Christian brides worried about sin and spiritual purity. The source of anxiety changed, but the underlying nervousness about wedding nights remained remarkably consistent across centuries. What's particularly striking is how modern wedding traditions still carry traces of ancient Roman DNA. We might not sacrifice pigs to Jupiter anymore, but wedding cakes echo those shared sacred meals. Wedding photographers capture moments that mirror ancient Roman emphasis on witnesses and public validation. Understanding how these traditions morphed over time reveals something crucial about human nature. We hold on to rituals that feel meaningful, even when their original purpose disappears completely. But speaking of things that disappeared, there were some wedding night practices so private that they were never written down at all. Roman wedding nights weren't just about two people falling in love and living happily ever after. They were complex social performances that revealed everything about what ancient Rome truly valued. Family power mattered more than personal feelings. Social order trumped individual desires, and every single ritual had layers of meaning that went far beyond the bedroom. The elaborate ceremonies we've explored show us a society obsessed with control. Romans didn't leave anything to chance, especially something as important as marriage. They planned every detail, from the lucky wedding date to the symbolic torch throwing, because they believed these rituals could literally shape the future. Makes sense, right? When your entire family's reputation and wealth depended on a successful marriage, you'd want to stack the deck in your favor too. But here's what's really fascinating about Roman wedding traditions. They mix genuine terror with celebration. Brides were expected to cry and resist leaving home, while guests threw nuts and sang crude songs. The same night that marked a girl's transition to womanhood was also filled with superstitions about evil spirits lurking in the shadows. Romans somehow managed to make their most joyous occasions feel like spiritual warfare. The wedding night rituals reveal Roman society's deep anxiety about fertility and family lineage. Every charm, every prayer, every symbolic act was designed to ensure children would follow. The pressure was enormous. Imagine being a teenage bride knowing that your worth as a person would be measured by how quickly you could produce sons. The pronuba watching over you, the household gods supposedly keeping track, the entire extended family waiting for proof that the marriage had been completed. It's enough to make anyone nervous. Then there's the fascinating contradiction between public celebration and private intimacy. Romans threw massive parties with hundreds of guests, elaborate processions through the streets, and enough noise to wake the entire neighborhood. But when it came to the actual wedding night, suddenly everything became secretive and sacred. Only a select few could even enter the house, and the bedroom door was locked tight against both evil spirits and curious relatives. The social expectations placed on these young couples were staggering. Brides had to master the delicate balance of appearing modest while also being fertile, obedient while also managing household affairs, and pure while also producing multiple children. Grooms faced their own pressures. They needed to prove their masculinity, demonstrate their authority, and somehow transform a frightened girl into a willing wife, all in one night. Well, the superstitions surrounding Roman weddings might seem silly to us now, but they served a real psychological purpose. Believing that garlic could ward off evil spirits, or that stepping on the threshold would bring bad luck, gave people a sense of control in an uncertain world. When medicine was primitive and childbirth could easily kill both mother and baby, magical thinking wasn't just comforting, it felt necessary for survival. Roman writers documented these wedding night experiences with surprising honesty. They wrote about the fear, the awkwardness, the comedy, and yes, occasionally the genuine affection that developed between couples. These accounts give us a window into the real human emotions behind all the elaborate rituals. Some brides were terrified, others were pragmatic, and a few were actually excited about their new lives. The evolution of these traditions tells its own story about Roman society. Early Republic weddings were simpler affairs focused purely on family alliances and property transfers. But as Rome grew wealthy and powerful, weddings became increasingly elaborate spectacles designed to show off status and wealth. The more extravagant the ceremony, the more important the families involved. And the weird part is how many of these ancient practices survived for centuries after Rome fell. European weddings continued incorporating Roman elements like white dresses, wedding veils, and threshold crossing ceremonies. We still throw rice at newlyweds, which directly descends from those nut-throwing Roman guests. The honeymoon tradition connects back to Roman beliefs about the first month of marriage being crucial for conception. Understanding Roman wedding nights helps us see past the marble statues and epic battles to glimpse how ordinary people actually lived. These weren't just historical curiosities. They were real human experiences filled with hope, fear, excitement, and uncertainty. Young people trying to navigate adult responsibilities while their families watched and judged every move. The complexity of Roman marriage rituals shows us a civilization that took nothing for granted. They believed deeply in the power of tradition, the importance of family, and the necessity of ritual to maintain social order. Whether those beliefs made people happier is debatable, but they certainly created a society that lasted over 1,000 years. Roman wedding traditions ultimately reveal a culture where individual desires took a backseat to family obligations, where superstition and practicality walked hand in hand, and where even the most intimate moments carried the weight of social expectations. These ancient ceremonies remind us that marriage has always been about much more than love.